Let me first turn it over to Ben Hovland for a brief synopsis of what was covered yesterday during the morning and the afternoon. Ben?
Thank you, Dr. Copen. So yesterday was obviously an action-packed day, pretty busy, particularly discussing the requirements. I think that we identified a number of issues that warranted additional conversation. And I think in the afternoon we recognized that part of today's agenda should be scrapped in favor of continuing that conversation because it was going in a very productive direction. So I think what we're going to do this morning is, again, revisit some of those issues that I know we noted for further conversation and see if we can get to a resolution on those. There were some broad open issues that we were going to also discuss, and then I know there are some resolutions that have been shared that also should be considered.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Would it be appropriate for us now to review and to act on the 3 resolutions that are before us? That have been submitted as a result of yesterday morning's deliberations. Mr. Choate, please.
This is Judge Choate. So we drafted up 3 resolutions. Why don't I read them off one at a time, and feel free to comment or wordsmith. There's no pride in authorship here. Number 1, resolution number 1. We recommend EAC commissioners formally adopt a yearly VVSG review process where proposed changes are considered by the TGDC and determinations are sent to the EAC executive director or a person operating in that capacity to begin the adoption process, and that whenever possible, processes overlap to ensure timely adoption of changes. Do we want to maybe discuss that one?
Let's open the floor for discussion and any points of clarification or recommended edits, please. The floor is open.
So, Judge, just for the record, explain where you talk about the processes overlapping, what you mean by that.
So that was Lori's addition to that, so I'm going to turn over the mic to Lori.
So wherever possible, to truncate the time that it takes to get these changes in front of our EAC commissioners, if possible, and in accordance with law, we'd like to see the Standards Board have an opportunity to review them concurrently with the Board of Advisors, and then, if possible, have public comment overlapping those at the same time, which then can reduce the amount of time overall that you're collecting that feedback and then getting to commissioners for consideration.
I think that point is clear here, but it may not be clear to someone reading this without the benefit of that context. And I'm just wondering whether looking at this whole concept of ensuring parallel or coincident processing, if you will, to ensure timely action and timely consideration of the changes. Mary Saunders, please.
So, Mary Saunders, I had a suggestion on that note. Potentially review processes are run concurrently to ensure adoption. Just a clarification.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Overlap has kind of a negative
It does.
connotation to it. Concurrently is,
Concurrently.
and just review processes, or however it's described in the in HAVA. And just a quick question, while I've got the mic. I strongly support this first resolution. A question related to Resolution 2. How are you differentiating between the types of changes? Resolution 1, with a yearly review, are those substantive changes versus, is that?
That's a good question. I'm going to, Diane?
Or I was going to say, rather than substantive, it's the non-controversial. You know what I'm saying? It's anything that's not just do it. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Because what's substantive and what's not, so yeah. But I think if you just say 2 is these de minimis changes, to use the word of the day yesterday, And these other ones need the annual, yeah.
Right. An example of this is Ben's favorite example about the 40 dBs for the sound is, okay, no, this is wrong, we made a mistake, let's fix it and move on as quickly as possible. So that's an example of one.
So do you guys have a recommendation on Resolution 1, like how we could rephrase it? I assume that's where the change would be if we made a change.
Mary, would you please summarize Mary Saunders, please, would you kindly summarize the change once again that you had proposed in Resolution 1?
Sure. Well, the change I had proposed was following the final comma, review processes operate concurrently to ensure a timely adoption. With respect to your follow-on question as how to define the types of changes that would be, I mean, would it be substantive, or there has some modifier? I'm not wedded to a particular modifier, but.
So this particular resolution came from a conversation that Ben was leading. Ben, do you have thoughts on how that could be changed to include more direct language?
Sorry, I was just looking to distinguish between the two, and I guess also feel like it's a slightly odd role for me here, but I think one of the distinctions, well, number one, for Resolution 1, I think you're possibly talking about, you're both talking about certainly substantial modifications, but you're also talking about additions, so new requirements, versus in 2, I would think you're talking only about relatively minor fixes, external technical standards, the example that McDermott gave. Sorry, I definitely think non-controversial is probably not the right word, because I think you have the appeal process if it's controversial, but I don't know, and, if, Paul, you have a good idea to bail me out, that would be amazing.
Paul Lux. I just wondered, do we need to make a specification in Resolution 1? Because isn't the idea of Resolution 1 that we want an annual review? And does it matter what changes we're considering on an annual review basis, whether they be controversial or non-controversial? Additions, et cetera. I think the annual review is the important part of Resolution 1, not so much what changes we're talking about, whereas Resolution 2 is differentiating to say, if it's a, if it's a technical thing or, some other standard that we are referring to changes, then that inherently changes it, and you can do that without dragging this out. And I think that's the difference between the two. I don't know that we need to specify in Resolution 1, because I think, again, the key point there is the annual review.
Neil Kelly, Paul kind of touched on it, but we had talked about this at the Board of Advisors, which is and thank you for reminding me, the policy versus technical, right? So if you just put those into those two silos and you do away with the controversial piece, doesn't that help split it up?
Okay, can I read a couple of recommendations? So on the first resolution, we recommend EAC commissioners formally adopt a yearly VVSG review process where proposed changes and/or additions are considered by the TGDC and determinations are sent to the EAC executive director or a person operating in that capacity to begin the adoption process, and that whenever possible, review processes such as Board of Advisor review, Standards Board review, and public comment periods run concurrently to ensure timely adoption of changes. And I'm going to say changes and/or additions. And then in the second resolution, we recommend EAC commissioners implement a process for EAC and NIST professional staff to make de minimis changes to the requirements in a timely manner, which includes an appeals process.
Would it be helpful, again, because of the interpretation, if you will, of de minimis, that perhaps would be more appropriate to say to make technical changes to the requirements in a timely manner, which include an appeals process?
I'm personally uncomfortable with technical changes because a technical change could be a pretty big stinking change, and that worries me. So I think de minimis is pretty well founded in law, at least in my state, that and if there's an appeals process built into that as well, I would feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
I'm worried about just calling it a technical
This is Bob
change.
Giles. Yeah, when we get reports back from the Vistals, they reference de minimis changes, so we're able to maybe adopt those changes without a full hearing for voting equipment at the state level. So I'm comfortable with de minimis.
Yeah. Any other discussion on that point?
The only flag I would make on de minimis is that it has an existing meaning in our testing and certification manuals. And so if we're creating something different here, I would be wary of that. And I would also just ask if 2 would be more appropriate to say, obviously, theoretically, we would be implementing the process, but a process for EAC professional staff in consultation with NIST staff. Again, I think that's more how the testing and cert program currently works. I'm looking at the back of the room to our director, but I don't know if anyone has thoughts or...
I like that last point. Neil, could you, so I think I didn't quite catch your point earlier that these are sort of already defined terms that might be siloed nicely for us already. Could you repeat
Right,
that?
thanks, Judd. So I was just thinking, and to Ben's point about, the Commissioner's point about struggling where the commission handles this and where staff might handle it, right? And so that's where I was saying that policy versus technical. You're making a good point, Laura. I mean, technical could be a big bucket, right? And I understand that. But certainly, I don't think you want staff going down the path of policy. I'm guessing. That takes away that big chunk out of the VVSG that might offer you some great heartburn.
It looks like, and I'm going to break the rules for a second here. I know we generally keep this to TGDC members, but it looks like that our testing and cert director, Mr. Lovato, has some valuable insight in how the process works that will hopefully save us time.
I apologize. We ran out of room somehow between yesterday and today over in our little corner. The term de minimis, I found, I guess, kind of the hard way just a few weeks ago when we had our security forum, is even though it's defined in our manual, it's still a loaded term. Just because it still does mean something different to almost probably everybody here at in this room. And so if there is even some other type of language, if it is technical, providing some kind of bounds around what is technical, or something to that effect. But I think just using the term de minimis kind of floats us into that then policy realm of where we're supposed to be looking at a technical requirement, and now it's like, well, is it or is it not? And it just kind of goes kind of something beyond what we think it should be. And so I think I like the concept of the first resolution, but I think just a different term would be helpful, and I just don't know what that would be.
So this is Bob Giles. Do you have your definition of de minimis? Because maybe if we agree and we can point to that particular definition of de minimis, because you already have it written somewhere, that might be helpful if we agree that that's...
Yeah, I'll pull it up now. I haven't.
I could also offer minor technical changes.
Yeah, I think that's more meaningful, personally.
I guess my concern, I'd still like to hear, because if you already have a definition of de minimis, minor, again, could be interpreted a lot of different ways. But if we have an actual definition we can point to, I think that might be helpful. And if it doesn't work, then we might just go with minor.
Right, and the other concern too is if that term changes in our manual. If it ends up being redefined, somewhere along the line where nobody here would probably have input as to what that means. And so that's just something to consider, and I'm having network issues, so once I'm able to pull up the definition, I can.
So, again, I would point out that Resolution 1 is talking about the VVSG review, and Resolution 2 is talking about the requirements.
Correct.
And the requirements are inherently more technical in nature, or potentially more technical in nature. And so, again, if from the Vistals we are already using the term de minimis, and there is a clear definition for what that means, and we all understand that that's what we're talking about, I don't think we need to worry about actions being taken under Resolution 2 tipping over into policy, because Resolution number 2 is not talking about changing the VVSG, which would be the standards and the principles. It's talking about the actual requirements.
I'll read you the definition. I looked this up the other day because it was in a court case, has to do with special ed. It's a long story. Too trivial or minor to merit consideration, especially in law. It's used primarily in law and tax law about what's a de minimis something or other, so you have to tax it or whatever. De minimis profit, I guess, which is literally like 0.025%. So, yeah.
I will just flag that is slightly different than the testing and certification manuals, which I'm about to get in trouble by going from memory, but essentially that it, and
I have it now. So our definition is it's a de minimis change is a change to voting system hardware that is so minor in nature and effect that it requires no additional testing and certification. Such changes, however, require VSTL review and endorsement as well as EAC approval. But that's not a real technical definition. This is a PowerPoint.
And it's been updated to include software.
Right, it includes software. But the idea is still the same, where it's in regards to, like in our context, it's to a certified voting system. I don't know if that matters at all in regards to requirement changes, but it might to some people.
I will, one other possible addition, since you were theoretically considering charging us with developing a process, I mean, you could plain language this and say minor or something to that effect. But again, what this resolution is about is asking us to implement a process or consider developing a program, et cetera. So I would guess that will lead to broader conversations that figure out the specifics of what that looks like.
Does inconsequential and, yeah, I'm just looking at synonyms, antonyms, for de minimis. Inconsequential, insignificant. I don't know that helps at all, or not.
I think it is along the lines of where you want the requirements, the minor requirement changes to still reflect the principles and guidelines, but you're allowing for the adjustment of like the decibel level and to continue and proceed. So it's about principle and guideline intent.
Right. For the most part, these are going to fall under the test assertions, for the most part.
So since, I guess, that de minimis definition doesn't really apply, maybe we just go with minor?
Okay, I'll read again, starting with the first one. We recommend EAC commissioners formally adopt a yearly VVSG review process where proposed changes and/or additions are considered by the TGDC and determinations are sent to the EAC executive director or a person operating in that capacity to begin the adoption process, and that whenever possible, review processes such as Board of Advisor review, Standards Board review, and public comment periods run concurrently to ensure timely adoption of changes and/or additions. Next one, we recommend EAC commissioners implement a process for EAC professional staff in consultation with NIST staff to make minor technical changes to the requirements in a timely manner. This should include the development of an appeals process for these minor technical changes.
Thank you so much, Lori. I'm just wondering on the second resolution, to the point that Ben Hovland had made earlier about charging the EAC commissioners to implement a process, which means that they will define a new process, that potentially that could be dealt with in a way that the EAC commissioners permit EAC and NIST professional staff to make, and then as you read, because waiting for someone else to create a process and to institute that process is perhaps an action that's not necessary. What we're asking for is simply permission that between the work of the EAC and the NIST professional staff that such appropriate changes can be made.
That's great. So I've rephrased it to say, we recommend EAC commissioners permit the EAC professional staff in consultation with NIST staff to make minor technical changes to the requirements in a timely manner. This should include the development of an appeals process for these minor technical changes.
Excellent. Excellent. That's exactly the context. Yeah.
And I will just flag so that people don't get mad at us later. I mean, this, I would guess, is a policy change for our agency, and that would require us to go through the process that we have to implement new policy. So, I mean, it's a little potato on what you say here, but no matter what, to implement something like that would require us to go through a process.
I think our purpose here, Lori Angino,
Yes.
our purpose here is providing you some recommendations that are important to this body.
Thank you.
Yeah. Excellent. Having heard modified resolutions 1 and 2, is the group ready to go, the group of TGDC voting members ready to go to accept these changes?
You want to do number,
We're going to do number 1 first.
we're doing number 3 at all?
Let's deal with those that we've discussed already. So for Resolution 1, as restated by Lori Agino, all in favor of the resolution to pass, raise your hand, please. All opposed? Same sign. Resolution 1 is passed as modified. Now, on to Resolution 2, again, as modified. Are we ready to go for a vote on this, or is more discussion needed? All in favor of Resolution 2 passing as modified, please raise your hand. All opposed, same sign. Resolutions 1 and 2 pass. Thank you so much. Now, let's discuss Resolution number 3. Any points of clarification needed on Resolution number 3?
So let me read it first. So Resolution 3, EAC commissioners should implement a fail-safe for VVSG changes in the circumstance where there is no quorum of EAC commissioners.
And just a quick question, did anybody think about what fail-safe is?
Well, I know what the old
Clearly,
I know
it's a
what I'd like it
backstop.
to be.
Cold War definition of it was.
It'd be helpful to, I think, get that out on the floor.
We welcome amendments. Neil, what do you got?
Well, I think that, I mean, this is broad, right? A policy that states what we said originally, which is that in the absence of a quorum, staff can take up the mantle and move the VVSG forward. I think that's the broadest definition.
So, Mary Saunders, how about something like should implement a provisional process for accepting that's a standards term. They can do provisional updates to standards in the absence of this, the quorum. So something along,
I like that. The only thing I'm thinking is that if it is provisional, then it could be unwound. I mean, and then you're back at square one potentially, right?
This is Dan Wallach. I love the idea of a provisional process, because then let's hypothetically imagine that we have an absence of a quorum, and then we have the provisional VVSG 2.1. At that point, a state could adopt it. That's their call. It's still voluntary. And then when there is a quorum, it could move from provisional to final. So I love the word provisional. It exactly captures the process.
Yeah, and actually, just someone whispering in my ear was helpful, because I understand, Mary, that the other standards industry, that's pretty typical, right? Okay, so that's helpful to have that, yeah. Yeah. I'm just thinking provisional ballots, I mean.
Well, and this is Paul. I would just point out, since we were hung up on the definition of de minimis earlier, fail-safe can be defined as equipped with a secondary system that ensures continued operation even if the primary system fails, which, even though we're not talking about systems, we're more talking about processes, but.
Thank you very much, Paul, for those points of clarification. Mr. Choate.
I was just going to point out that the failsafe also has a storied history in movies with Henry Fonda, so maybe we want to stay away from that connotation as well.
This is Bob Giles. Oh.
Yes, Bob?
So does provisional get us to a place, and I guess this is for Ben or for Cliff, if your legal interpretation is that the commissioners have to vote on this as a final adoption, if we put something provisional in there to allow for it to move forward in the absence of a quorum, does that get us in a place where the commissioners or Cliff as legal counsel are more comfortable before we, because I don't want to pass something today that you guys are just going to ignore, because you're going to say legally we can't do that. So thanks for the resolution, but we're not doing it. I don't want to waste everyone's time. So if we can have a bit of a conversation about that, that might be helpful.
I would look forward to Ben Hovland's comments on this again as well. This is Walt Copan. I'm wondering whether the TGDC wants to propose a process to be ratified by the commissioners, that the TGDC members and professional staff believe is workable in the absence of a quorum, and that could be a follow-on action then from this group to provide such a process document. I would anticipate it would be less than 1 page in length. But to the point that we shared earlier on, at least providing the commissioners the starting point for consideration, I believe, would be most helpful based on what the TGDC believes is workable.
This is Bob Giles. I like that approach, and I don't know if there are other agencies that deal with situations like this, and if NIST can maybe even point to those, I think that would be helpful to say. So it's not just, and I like that we're giving them a starting point, we're actually not just telling them it's a problem, we're giving them a solution to the problem.
One thing I'd flag, and I'm not able to speak for any commissioners other than myself, but I think it's worth considering that the commission has previously taken action to ensure that the advisory boards are able to function without a quorum, and so we know that's possible. As we were discussing yesterday in the HAVA process, this body kicks it off. The other boards review it. There are. What HAVA says is that we can't vote to adopt it until 90 days after the other board has seen it. I think we've seen instances where NASED and others have, VVSG 1.1 was essentially waiting for the restoration of a commission or a quorum. Whether or not that's been utilized is a different conversation. But I guess the point is, I think that when the 2015 quorum adopted policies that allowed for the advisory boards to continue to function with a lack of a quorum, in some ways that has set up some of this. I mean, certainly there is the room to continue a process forward where you're developing something that is useful, whether or not that can be called a provisional VVSG, or I'm not going to get into the legal specifications of that, but I think there's at least already some structure in place to be productive in the absence of a quorum.
So this is Bob Giles. And getting back to the recommendation, I think we should put something out there. It took you guys a year and a half to give us a legal opinion on this. From the point that you guys said it should not be separated. So my concern is if we just ask you to develop something, who knows how long that could take. So I like the idea of us actually handing you something to say this is workable, this is agreeable. The TGDC, NIST, and other agencies agree that this is a workable solution. So I think we take it out of your hands and make a suggestion, then put it back in your hands so you actually have something to work with.
Yeah, I think Ben is absolutely right. We're in a different position today than we were, before 2015, because back then we couldn't even meet as a body. But now all of the boards can meet. We can go through the entire process all the way up to it's time to hand it to the commissioners. So there is room to do that, and I could see that that's what the process would likely be.
This is Bob Giles, and I agree, but and I don't want to get to that point and then it sits on an empty table because you don't have a quorum, and it sits there for years and years, and there is no mechanism to get it across the finish line.
So this is Mary Saunders. I'd be happy to provide a couple of examples from standards developing organizations about their provisional standards process. I know IEEE has one. I'm looking at NFPA, which is the National Fire Protection Association. It's a code and standards organization, and typically SDOs roll out provisional standards in order to make them available to the user community on a reasonable basis. Allows the technical committee to publish the standard, roll it out to, in this case, the first responder community, responses so that they can use it. That standard, it's a provisional standard, it goes immediately back into the revision cycle. In this case, once that revision cycle, full revision cycle is active, the approval cycle, but it allows you to get a document out there that's gone through most of the way through the process, the technical process, so that the stakeholders can actually say, is this going to work or not? So I can give you a couple of examples of what they use. I can give you a couple of examples of how it works in standards developing organizations, sorry.
Neil Kelly, my sense is that over the last year and a half or so that we've been discussing this is that there's been discomfort among the commission about the issue, and it seemed to me that it was outside of statute. And now what we're being told is that it's within statute. In other words, you can go through this whole process, you get to the point where the commission has to act on it, and if there's no quorum, then nothing happens. As a manufacturer, if you have a provisional standard, are you going to want to invest in developing systems that you know could be potentially changed down? I mean, it seems to me that standards of first responders is, I understand that you're sort of changing process, but you're actually manufacturing something. Isn't that different?
McDermott from Unison. It's a risk, absolutely. But if you know that something's coming down the line, and generally speaking, you're probably going to want to work towards the previous standard. So you're not going to be working towards the newest one until you know it's actually going to be the thing.
So this is probably not the right way to say it, but it's for show, right?
Well, I think what we're trying to do is get to the point where if there is not a quorum, we can actually not make it provisional, but say, this is it. And if you want to make changes, well, then we're going to go do another version with the changes in it.
Yeah.
So this is Mary Son again. To speak to risk, I'm speaking generally. There's also a risk of continuing to manufacture to a significantly outdated standard. So, manufacturers would have to evaluate the relative risks of looking to a 10-year-old standard versus a provisional, much more recent standard. And if it's gone through N rounds of a consensus process, only missing one final round, it's a risk you have to consider, but balance the risks of not having something current out there.
Mr. Tatum has some information that can inform this conversation.
Mr. Chair, I'd just like to put a little context on your conversation. As the body will recall, part of this discussion is relating to changes to the VVSG, to the requirements that address new innovations. As the requirements will be developed by this body and adopted by the EAC, any clarity that needs to be provided to the existing requirements would come from the test insert in the form of an RFI, a request for interpretation, and in some instances a notice of the NOC. Help me there. But my point is, as new systems are developed, a vendor would determine whether they would meet the existing requirements as they currently exist, and if that system doesn't meet the new requirement, then we're looking at modifying or creating a new requirement that would address that particular new innovation. And that is what would then be considered. So we should be mindful that when we talk about modifications and changes, what exactly we're talking about to the requirements. It's to cover new innovation. So as a vendor identifies something, then we get to the bridge of, does it meet that requirement, or do we have to consider something new? Updates to the requirements are a completely different matter. And I think the Commission could identify methods to revise existing requirements as they've been adopted by the Commission. New requirements, if it's a new innovation, it certainly could be a policy matter that staff would not be able to address.
So this is Bob Giles. And I guess, and again, because we took the approach, we developed these high-level principles and guidelines, so most likely we wouldn't have to touch those again. It would really take something extraordinary for us to have to go back in. And that's why we wanted the requirements to be separate and not be at the mercy of the commissioners and not require a vote of the commissioners. You are now saying legally they have to, that is your legal interpretation, that if there is a change or a new requirement, that it has to go through the full process, just like the VVSG, in order for it to be adopted. Is that what you're saying, Cliff, or is that changed?
I didn't say that exactly because I provided an opinion to the commissioners for them to address. But the point I'm making is, there's a big discussion about whether wireless modeming and so forth should be part of the process. And the requirements, the technical requirements to allow for wireless in any form of or process is a technical requirement. But to say, yes, we're going to use wireless modeming, that is a policy decision that we're not certain that staff would be the people to make. So that would be a commissioner issue, even though it's technical in nature.
And Bob Giles again, and that's a great point, because what if that becomes an issue and for whatever reason a lot of states want to move in that direction, and we don't have a quorum of commissioners? It just sits there and maybe they require EAC certification in order to use that in their state, and we sit there for years without, so do we just tell that state you're on your own? And this is what we're saying now. That's a requirement, and whether it's a policy or a technical requirement, that's what this whole debate is about. It's about something coming along down the road that we don't know about right now, and you are absent of quorum, and we're stuck without being able to update the requirements.
And I would just like to chime in here to flag that I am 100% supportive of having this conversation, but this is obviously longer than the time we have remaining, and what we're here to do today is to try to get through these requirements so that we can start building. And I think part of what I was saying yesterday was I would love to have this conversation while people are building. And so I'm not saying that we shouldn't continue this conversation, but I'm saying we are eating into the limited amount of time we have left today.
This is Bob Johnson. I appreciate that, but this conversation keeps getting punted down the road. And whether it's the Standards Board, the Board of Advisors. This conversation started in April of 2018 when after years of us talking about these being separate, completely separate, and the commissioners not being required to vote on the requirements, you guys changed the rules on that and changed your interpretation of that in 2018. So here we are in September of 2019, still having the conversation and still trying to punt it down the road further. This body is charged with looking over the requirements and making these recommendations. And that is a concern of this body, that we don't get together that often. So I get it, we're on a time crunch today. And to be honest, I mean, this is really important, at least to me personally, I believe members of this board. And if it eats into the time of the requirements, I'm not rushing through these requirements then, because if you're telling me we can't guarantee that if you guys pass these along today and adopt these today or recommend these today, that it's not 2 years before we get another shot at it. And that's my concern, that if new technology comes along, we have to go through this process if there's no quorum. And we get it, you know, there's two debates here, whether you have to vote or not on the requirements. And then if you guys are adamant that you do, then the second is, in absence of a quorum, there has to be some fail-safe, provisional, whatever we're going to call it. So to me, it is a critical discussion that we just keep kicking down the road. And we've yet to really have you guys say yes or no. And the Standards Board, the Board of Advisors, they've all passed, you know, recommendations for you guys to address this. And going back to April of this year, and has there been any conversation on this, you know, since the two boards recommended it? And now you're going to get a third board recommending it, and it just seems like, all right, let's get through the meeting, let's pass these, and we'll worry about that the next time one of the boards brings it up. And I mean, that's my personal feeling.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giles. I think that this is an area that all of us believe is important for the effective functioning of the TGDC, and provide timely updates to the requirements as would benefit the American voting public. We discussed a little bit earlier that the TGDC members will work together to provide a recommended process for the EAC to consider. And I'm just wondering whether we could bring this particular item to a close by voting on Resolution 3 as we have amended it, with this understanding that within 30 days from today, that a proposed process will be delivered to the EAC commissioners for consideration.
So I have some proposed new recommended language adding this 30-day thing. EAC commissioners should ratify a provisional requirements review and approval process for the EAC professional staff to update VVSG requirements in the circumstance where there is no quorum of EAC commissioners. The TGDC will provide a process recommendation within 30 days.
We've heard resolution number 3 as modified being read. Are we ready to go to a vote on this matter? Thank you.
Sorry, can I just get a point of clarification? Maybe this is for Cliff, but in HAVA, are the requirements tied to VVSG in statute so that it must move forward in that manner? Or is it just that the process for the final adoption of any changes has to go before the commission? So I'm trying to figure out if you can parse those two out in statute.
Mr. Tatum?
Go. The HAVA provides that the Election Assistance Commission will create voluntary voting system guidelines for certifying voting systems. The voluntary voting system guidelines are standards and requirements. You can develop principles and guidelines that a voting machine vendor cannot build to. So it is, by definition, requirements have to be included in those guidelines. There are certainly, as identified, different types of requirements. So the commission could look at developing a separate process for dealing with the different types of requirements. There are policy related and there are technical related. And there's been a proposal submitted to the commission.
Thank you for that clarification. Appreciate it.
This is Judd. I just would renew my request to see that legal opinion when it's appropriate.
This is Brian Newby, and this may be another thing for our general counsel, but just, I guess, to Bob's point, if there is a 30-day process, I think wouldn't the TGDC need to define how that's going to happen? Would that be through some public meeting, phone calls? I mean, I just want to make sure you, however you're going to approve it in 30 days, you don't leave that loose and then that drifts itself. I don't know. That might be that's a legal thing perhaps, but.
So this is Judd. I think the 30-day part was about how long from this moment it will be before we provide the recommended process.
But how is we? Who is we? Wouldn't the TGDC have to vote on what that recommended process is?
Okay, I get where you're going.
Yes, and as this group has been operating very effectively using webcast programs and conference calls on an interim basis, that I would see that there would be a vote of the TGDC members on the proposed process within that time frame. Would not require another physical in-person meeting, but that there would be a sub-team of the TGDC that would develop such a draft process, provide inputs from all the other members, at least to have that opportunity to review, and then to agree that this is ready to be passed along to the commission.
I was just suggesting you define that process here. That's all. So.
Any other comments before we go to a vote on Resolution 3 as modified? Lori, would you read that once again, just so we know?
EAC commissioners should ratify a provisional requirements review and approval process for the EAC professional staff to update VVSG requirements in the circumstance where there is no quorum of EAC commissioners. The TGDC will provide a process recommendation within 30 days.
Excellent. Any other discussion before we go to a vote? All in favor, please raise your hand. All opposed, same sign. Resolution 3, as modified, has been passed. So, Lori, thank you so much for your very good and timely edits to these resolutions. It's been a great service to the TGDC members here today and those who have joined us remotely. Ben, next order of business, please.
I think next up probably should be working through the issues that were raised yesterday that were noted that there could be probably minor changes, and just to make sure that those are sort of in order.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I know that there's been some good note-taking on those matters, and that we should now move to discuss them. Mary, would you lead us through this process, please? Mary Brady.
Okay, Ben, this is Mary Brady. I still can't see it.
Wow.
Keep trying.
Keep going.
Oh, excellent.
Really?
Are we there yet?
I'm still going.
Keep going.
Yeah, I'm still nowhere close.
Oh, I'm close.
I'm getting there. It's getting, I'm maybe leaning over the table, but.
I just got to use my first pair of progressives. It's killing me. Oh, right.
Okay, so these are organized by principle and were captured as we went through the day. My suggestion is that we run through them. My recollection of what occurred yesterday is that some like perhaps this first one is calling for an outside document, an external document. That's something that we can agree on and move on. There are some that that highlight that there were some changes that were perhaps in the red line version.
Real quick, Mary, this is Jerome. Would you like me to print that out and distribute it?
It could be helpful, yes. Yes.
Yeah, if you said.
Ben has the copy, has the only copy, so you'll have to get with Ben. Yes. Well, I have the raw notes I can recreate.
And Mary, I do think this is an appropriate time to jump in and say, I think that what we're trying to look at here is if the sense of this body was captured yesterday, so that if we move to a point of the TGDC recommending the requirements move forward, that it's noting, this isn't about the TGDC dotting every I and crossing every T. It's recognizing that these requirements are in a position with these notes taken to move forward in the process. I think that's what we're hoping to ask later today. And so as you look at these, I think it's not about necessarily wordsmithing everything, but making sure that the sentiment of this body was captured, and then the NIST team will insert that. And as was discussed yesterday, this is just the first step in a longer process.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Ben. And I do think there are some that fall into that category, but if I could, I think there's a number of different categories that we're looking at. One is external document. The second is perhaps the principles, the red line version of the principles and guidelines went too far, and there's some considerations on changing it back. So that's an area where both Ben and I are noting those changes and those discussions, and they can be handled, I believe, before a vote by the commission. I think there's still time to make those changes. And then there's others that are changes to the actual requirements themselves. They fall into a couple of categories, as Ben mentioned. There's some, so for instance, one perhaps like multi-factor authentication for critical operations. We've got multiple opinions here. One, on the one side, it says like, okay, let's just drop opening and closing polls from that list, otherwise that list is okay. On the other side, it's like, I think all changes here require multi-factor authentication. Perhaps that's an area where this body has weighed in a little bit, and we need additional election officials in particular to weigh in, which will happen as part of the standards board review process. So perhaps that's an area that we can say, okay, we believe there should be some multi-factor authentication here. Let's let the review process take care of it. And there are other areas where it's like, no, perhaps maybe ballot identifiers where we really sort of need to come to a conclusion. I propose that we just go ahead and start stepping through these. Ben will be taking notes, perhaps capturing the wisdom of the group, so we can see it in front of us. Is that possible, Ben?
Yeah, you can see it right there.
Okay. And let's just step through them, and hopefully we can get through all of them.
Since Diane Golden, since the first one's mine, the only thing I would add to this is that last clause in Principle 5, without discrimination, I think my point is, I don't know how we leave that in the principle when there is nothing in the guidelines or the requirements that actually addresses non-discrimination and segregation. I mean, I hate to say it, but we have something in a principle, and we can't say that this is going to happen. If you follow those requirements, there is nothing to say that you're not going to be discriminating and segregating, because there is nothing in there that prevents that from happening. So I think we're being disingenuous by putting it in the principle, making us feel good that we've done something about this when we haven't.
Okay, so we're talking about Principle 5, equivalent and consistent voter access. All voters can access and use the voting system regardless of their abilities without discrimination. And the point here is that there were no requirements that actually support it.
Has this particular topic been the conversation of this board either yesterday or prior in terms of the definition of how this sort of without discrimination clause will be then reflected in the standard language in the requirement?
No. I mean, the discussion, the whole issue of the segregated machine has been discussed, but it's out of scope, quote unquote, because That's not about the machine itself. It's about how many of them and how, the voting process is set up and all of those. So I'm not saying we've ignored our duty by not addressing it. We've been told it's out of scope, so we can't address it. So what I'm saying is we need to take it out of the principle then, because we are not doing anything to address discrimination and segregation. We're allowing it because we've been told it's out of scope to address it, I guess. And I will point out, if you look at the other standards in there, we have standards about positioning of the voting system and reach ranges and clear floor space around the voting system. So to me, that's wandering away from the system itself anyway, and the positioning and things around it. So I don't know how we consistently are being told we can't address the other issue, which is the number and the segregation of this. Anyway, but so in answer to your question, it's been discussed, but it's always been pushed out of scope. And my point is just, if we're not going to address it, then we need to take the words "without discrimination" out of the principle, because we're not addressing it.
Lori Agino, are there places where, how we've kind of referred to other documents or best practice research, and we've referenced that to point folks to go where to find those most up-to-date recommendations? Could that be a method that we would want to consider implementing to still deal with the issue and ensure that we're addressing it?
I think that was the discussion yesterday with a guidance document. And honestly, this is, again, I'll use the Access Board as an example. In accessibility circles, this is what you do. You define how many accessible parking places in a parking lot based on a whole bunch of ratios of how big the building is, how many total parking spaces there are, blah, blah, blah. How many accessible stalls do you need to have in a bathroom in a building? How many of the, where are they located? What's the egress to get to them? They deal with this all the time in the built environment. And so it's a similar issue, but very unique, because voting happens in a lot of different ways, whether it's, vote centers, you're taking equipment out, what do you do? Does everybody who goes out? So there's a lot of things to think about and discuss. And my fear is, as I said earlier, there's litigation starting already. I don't want the courts deciding this, because they are going to mess this up. And then we'll be dealing with conflicting court decisions and trying to figure out. It would be so much better if people who understood voting and accessibility did this. So whether we do it as a guidance document, or at some point in the future it becomes required, I don't care. My soapbox today is I do not want that term "without discrimination" in a principle when we have not done a darn thing to address it.
Thank you, and I believe that Lori Agino had a very good suggestion here to reference documents, best practices, et cetera.
There aren't any at the moment, so we'll have to build them.
Okay, and Mr. Tatum, you've been patient.
Mr. Chair, to Mrs. Golden's point, I'd remind the group that HAVA itself identifies that there should be at least one voting system in each, I'm not sure if it uses the term precinct, but within each jurisdiction for voting. Polling place. And I'd also remind Mrs. Golden that what the requirement is establishing is that the voting component shall not discriminate. So whether there's 10 or 20, the purpose of the requirement is to ensure that the one unit, that unit does whatever it's supposed to do in a non-discriminatory manner in 20 different units, but it's got to be the one that it starts with the one and then it's replicated. And I follow the analogy with the Access Board. But they're not exactly corollaries as it relates to the building of a unit. So I just point that out. I think the body I would encourage the body to perhaps pass a resolution that suggests that the EAC develop the guidelines that addresses the question that you want to be identified.
And I'm, that's kind of where we were yesterday, and I'm fine with that. I would respectfully disagree. Machines don't discriminate. just the term discrimination has a very clear understanding in the disability world, and that is people discriminating and people with disabilities being segregated and treated separately differently. And that is exactly what happens when when literally HAVA itself has set up this dilemma by saying one accessible machine as if that somehow is not discriminatory in and of itself. And separate is not equal, period. So I'm just saying, I don't think that we are being, upfront by having that clause in that principle. I just think it needs to come out. It doesn't add anything, so anyway.
Sharon might have something.
Yeah. Sharon, do you have a comment that you'd like to share?
Yes. Well, so I certainly agree that we need to deploy these properly. We got kind of halfway there, I think, when we said that any electronic system has to be fully accessible. So the question is one of deployment. So to me, that's maybe 1/3 of the way there. I guess the issue in writing these guidelines was how can we talk about the deployment in other areas of the standard, like the area around the space and reachability around the voting station. We have said the manufacturers have to specify what that is. Yeah, in this case, they can't specify how many. That's, so the guidance document was the only way I saw going forward, but I would certainly entertain any other suggestions to make this work better.
And last time, I get that, and if we do, this is going to take time to develop, so like I said, there are no best practices to point to, and that's my concern. Clearly, one machine in a corner, in my book, is discriminatory, pure and simple, but if a judge decides it's every machine has to have everything, okay, that's going to send folks into a tailspin. That's going to be a whole nother, you don't want that. So what is right, 50-50? Probably not. I don't know what's right. But, so the guidance document, but I'll just go on record, I want this principle changed because it offends me personally that we think we're doing something about discrimination when we're not. We're actually going to be encouraging it, not discouraging it with, anyway.
Neil Kelly, I think Diane has a good point, because I just want to use the example and follow on what Cliff was saying. In California, under the vote center law currently, they have changed it from 1 accessible unit to a requirement of 3. And I have just acquired our new voting system, and I thought that was too low, and so I went to 5. So when you have something in statute that says this is what you should do, well, that's what all the election officials are doing in California. They're putting in 3. Yeah. So having some good guidance document that says under certain formulas or under certain situations, this is what you might go to would be helpful. I really do.
Yeah. It seems to me that there's broad agreement here that such supplemental guidance would be appropriate in order to address this particular very important principle. And I would personally recommend not striking that reference at this time from the principles in view of all the work that's been done, but let's anticipate and let the record show that work will proceed within the TGDC and also within the community of interest to have the guidance for the deployment of these systems that are outlined in the requirements section of VVSG 2.0.
Yes, and I also think any guidance document that gets written needs input from NASET, needs input from the Access Board and other disability advocacy groups.
Indeed.
This is Bob Giles. I agree. I think having a document, and I think we leave it in there to hold our feet to the fire and make us do that. If we pull it out, then it may just get lost in the shuffle. So I like the example you used with the parking lot. That's when we do our ADA compliance for polling places, we go in and we know that I have to have 3, I have to have 5, whatever the number is. So if there's a formula that you're comfortable with and the community's comfortable, we may not get to a total agreement, but I think having a guidance document is critical, and I think we should leave it in there to make us do that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Giles. Sachin, you had a point to make, please.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Diane was saying. As a disabled person, often when I go to a polling place, the place I vote is in the corner where it's separated from everyone else. So it is important for us to really look into something like this, and just like Diane was saying, putting it in the language saying that we're addressing something without really addressing is just trying to show to the disability community that there's not, there's really no validity to it, because it's not been addressed and it's still being kind of pushed around. So no, it is constantly a pattern in any polling places. We get shoved in the corner, so it needs to be really addressed.
I'd just add, again, I can only speak for myself here, but, in my time, I've noticed that all of the commissioners are very cognizant of the fact that the Help America Vote Act that created this agency was an accessibility law, and have shown a lot of dedication to this issue. I think this naturally lends itself to a potential working group that we could create with the entities that were mentioned, and I'm happy to take that and discuss it with my colleagues.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've had, I think, a very rich conversation about this topic. We all believe that these are important principles to be addressed within the requirements section, and then an action plan has just been outlined for us by Mr. Hovland. So the next item then on our list. Ben?
Oh, other Ben, sorry.
Mr. Long.
So the next one is, Guideline 5.1, the discussion of the meaning of modes. Guideline 5.1, discussion of the meaning of the term modes. I've highlighted it on this screen. It states, I think of Golden, this might have been your comment, that there was a wording change in the word modes in some of the language changes that occurred, and you made some comments about the consequences of those changes, and you wanted to ensure a consistent experience across the modes. Did you have more to say on that?
Yeah, so this is Mary, but this particular comment was against the guideline, not the requirement, so it was the red line version of the guideline.
And I thought the conversation was useful yesterday, and it was noted to the degree of where we are with the principles and guidelines.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is, after I read through, it's on page 129, the whole discussion of that principle and those two guidelines, the word method's never used in that whole page. It uses mode. So somehow I just think that edit doesn't even make sense with what you've got in the rest of the wording, because anyway, so just go back and look at it, and I do think it just fundamentally changes. Actually, the language on page 129 is much better and clearer than either of, anyway, so.
When I went back and thought about it, this is Sharon Laskowski, a voter could use a combination of modes as well. So putting it as a method kind of brings it up a level. So maybe what needs to be done is to look at the discussions underneath it to clarify what we mean by method versus mode, because and thinking about it again, I do like the word method there, because it's broader. It's not just the experience for a particular mode, but whatever combination of access a voter's using.
It seems to me, and I think the points have been well made here, that the revised text of that section then will define method at the higher level, and then the mode or combination of modes in the context of that definition. Very good. Thanks.
Noted.
Next topic, please.
Can I ask this is Judd, can I ask a clarifying question real quick? Or perhaps I will state what I think I heard yesterday, and somebody can tell me if this is correct. So the red line version that we have, the changes were made by, and what I think I heard was a combination of the EAC working with NIST. Is that in like working groups on particular points?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
So we had the recommendation from Neil to document the comparison between version 1.1 of the VVSG and 2.0. Is such a document actually available?
No. So this is Mary. So yesterday we indicated that it was available. It is available on the human factors front, but it's something that we can put together and make available. We have the information in various places, and so it is certainly something that we could put together and make available.
So NIST will then take the action to provide that comparison document. Thank you very much. The next point is under gestures, please.
I can elucidate. This is Sharon, if you wish. So there was some discussion about going beyond simple gestures. In a universal design, and Sashin addressed this, we want some simple gestures. It's not so much for accessibility. We're not going to match what people are used to for their personal assistive technology, and they can't learn something different at the polling place. We wanted to just include very simple gestures like touch to scroll, not necessarily for accessibility, but for all voters, because that's kind of an expectation now with the technology. So that's why we kept it as a very simple and not trying to address all the different kinds of gestures someone might use with their smartphone as a personal assistive device. I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Very good. Thank you so much. Any other discussion on this point before we move to the next? Thanks. Then we'll move on to Principle 6, please, Guideline 6.2 and 6.2a. This is on the E-to-E considerations. Mary Brady, would you like to discuss this topic, please?
Be happy to. I'm trying to figure out where we are. So this was, Sharon, I think it was under voter privacy.
6.2, voters can mark, verify, cast their ballot, or other associated cast vote record without assistance from.
Would you put the mic on, please?
This is Sharon. 6.2, voters can mark, verify, and cast their ballot or other associated cast vote record without assistance from others. And the discussion was, what about an E-to-E systems? My point was that we would look at that we believe that if there's verification that's included in an E-to-E system, which is after the voter leaves the polling place, that would be covered.
And no, it's not going on. It's too many are on. Okay, Diane Golden. My suggestion was just to add to the discussion box of 6.2a the fact that end-to-end is covered in the verifying of that. So if your end-to-end thing prints a little print receipt that you're handing to somebody, that's not going to fly, which, as far as I know, that's what they all do now. So it's just to call that out, that voters can mark, verify, and cast, and verify. You know, even though it doesn't have verify again at the end, if you're doing an end-to-end system, that accessibility requirements applies, and you're going to have to figure out how to make that end receipt thing accessible.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just adding a discussion in there.
Thanks so much. Yes, that action will be taken then as a follow-on. Wonderful. The next discussion point, please.
So this next one is under Guideline 8.3, and this one applies to the guideline. And I believe Judd, Laurie, and McDermott, I think at the point of the discussion yesterday, we weren't sure whether or not we could update the guideline, but it appears as though we have an opportunity to do that. And Judge, you had suggested an alternate wording for the guideline. McDermott, you had asked whether or not who's the judge of reasonably easy. So the guideline is 8.3. which says the voting system is evaluated with a wide range of representative voters, including those with and without disabilities, for effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. I suspect that the reasonably easy comes from a discussion under the requirements. Is that correct, Sharon? And Lori, you had some issues with evaluated by voters.
Yeah, Sharon, please.
So these, both 8.3 and 8.4 actually are based on requirements that were even in 1.0. And that's basically is to conduct formal usability test with test participants that reflect the voter population and the election worker population and collect standard metrics. So this is kind of rather, best practice standardized wording that we've been using since 2005.
I don't want to belabor discussing the principles and guidelines, but I wondered, in reflecting on this conversation yesterday, if part of, obviously people were noting the change from by and for with the intention being a by, but is part of, I guess, is part of the issue here as we split, or as the principles and guidelines have been split from the requirements. These are high-level principles which people want this to be used by election workers. Now, the requirements, how do you implement that? Well, this is what a test looks like to know whether or not it can be used by election workers. So, I don't know if that was where the rub was, but
I do think that there is some confusion on whether or not you are actually using election workers and as part of your those who are testing the system. And I think that got cleared up as part of the discussion that yes, the election workers are still test subjects, and but it is a usability expert that is likely running the test.
Yes.
No. I'll help you out.
Yeah, this is Diane. It's the sentence structure, Old English, the sentence structure is really bad because the changing that by, for, and the by at the end of the sentence, the whole sentence structure, I just rewrote it, said usability of the voting system by election workers is evaluate. I mean, it's the clause, it's the by being at the end of it. Does that relate to they're doing the usability testing, or are they the test subjects? And it's unclear because it's stuck at the end of the sentence in both of those principles. The voters and the election workers stuck at the end of the sentence where you've got the usability testing and then the test subjects, and it's just worded poorly. So without reading that with a whole bunch of requirements underneath it, you are going to misinterpret it. And I think that's the challenge. If this document's supposed to stand on its own and people are going to use it, then I'd suggest somebody revise the sentences so they're clearer. But
Well, yeah, there were lots of different suggestions, and we didn't come up with good wording. There's only two requirements, one for 8.3 and 1.8.4, so there's not a whole bunch of requirements. There's only one under each one. We use the word with election work, usability tests with election workers, with voters in the requirements. So, and in Guideline 8.3 says evaluate with a wide range of representative voters. So maybe we need to put a parallel construction in 8.4. So evaluate for usability with representative election workers or something along that line, if we're still wordsmithing guidelines.
Yeah.
There's only one requirement. I think it's clear from the requirement what the meaning is. So
Well, I think we can take it as an action that we'll provide any support that Ben needs to in clarifying the the guideline.
This is McDermott. What we're really trying to do is make sure that the system is usable by people who are performing the functions of a poll worker. Anybody can be a poll worker to within certain limits, I think. So a voter can be a poll worker.
Our testing actually describes sort of the typical demographics that you would use for, and you'd get some novice election workers and some experienced election workers to test with.
Just to pause this conversation temporarily, we received a report that this streaming service may not be working. I don't know if somebody with a computer can check. It may just be an individual's device, but we'd like to make sure that we are in fact able. Okay.
It seemed to be working, but it was never showing what's up on the board, so it's only showing just the people interaction.
Got it. So this sounds like what was reported was maybe an individual device issue. Thank you.
Okay, so our next, I think that's it for human factors. The next set of comments are against the core. So this is Ben Long and John Wack. John, you might want to join us just in case there are questions. That under Guideline 2.1, Jeff Hale noted that the change in the guideline language does not match the scope implied by the guideline language as a result of the red line version does not match the requirements. Essentially the guideline used to apply to systems, and after the red line change, it's systems, voting system software. The requirements actually apply to systems, but, so that's I think that's noted, and we'll work to make that change. The next comment was on reproducible builds, and Dan, you brought this up, and there was a fair amount of discussion on whether or not we should require, whether or not there should be requirements that might permit reproducible builds on requirements on the manufacturers. There was discussion that this is taken care of as a result of testing and the QA, the quality assurance configuration management components that'll be moved to the AAC testing and certification manual. It is true that after some conversation with Dan last night, it is true that in modern software engineering, you would normally have, if you have a rather complex system, you would have some method to you would have some software that would allow you to do automated builds, continuous integration testing, things of that nature that really sort of limit the number of errors that can be introduced by a change or by configuration changes, because it's encapsulated in what used to be. There's been a lot of progress since the early days of makefiles in terms of creating this type of environment. The challenge is it's different depending on what language you're using to build in. So the question is, should there be requirements along this? Should it be perhaps handled in a guideline document, or should it be left to the manufacturers to choose a build environment that suits them?
Thanks very much. I'm conscious of the fact that we have kind of gone beyond our scheduled break time. So I'd like to invite David to make a comment and then suggest that we go to a break, a 10-minute break, please. Thank you.
David Wagner, I'm confused by this discussion, and I want to check whether Dan feels that his concern has been addressed. So there's two notions in which you could imagine that, talking about build. One is just it has to be possible to build it again another time. That's where build processes come in. The second, a stronger notion, is reproducible build, that you have to be possible to build it again and get exactly the same binaries. And that usually takes extra care that isn't usually present in most modern build processes, and just relying on people to have modern software engineering will not provide a reproducible build that produces the same binary. So I wanted to find out which of those you were advocating for, Dan, and find out whether this, what you're talking about, Mary, actually addresses that or not. Because I'm concerned that maybe Dan was talking about a reproducible build to get the same binary, and that maybe that's not getting addressed with the proposed action.
And I would just sort of add on to that is, does the current practice already provide us with reproducible builds? With I know McDermott had mentioned that this is built by the VSTL and then pushed out from the VSTL.
I mean, that would Mr. McDermott, that's not necessarily a reproducible build, but what we have is one build that is tested, and that is the one build that is used for everywhere. And actually, if we have a build that was from somewhere else, we want to know it.
So we talked a lot about this at dinner later on. I'm not prepared to say that VVSG 2.0 should specify there shall be reproducible builds. That might be something that we want to bring up for subsequent revision.
Very good. I think these points of clarification have been very helpful. I now suggest that we take a break and that we have 10 minutes to do so. So let's reconvene here at 10:36.
Hopefully.
Thank you all. We are ready to resume. And as we are taking our seats, I am asking how many of our members of the TGDC will be able to stay here until noon. Let me just by show of hands. Till noon.
No, we're good.
Very good. Thanks. In light of that, we'd like to go forward and consider some of the open topics that have not been fully discussed. We have a presentation chart that's up on the one screen, but it's not in the lower one. And then we'll come back to the other points of editing that were reviewed yesterday. So let me turn it over to Gemma at this time.
Hi, this is Bob Giles before Gemma. So we're not finishing this document today?
We're going to come back to those
Come back
points.
to it? Okay.
So in the meantime, what I'm doing is trying to get a handle on how many more of these issues do we have to go through, as opposed to just going through point
Do
by
every
point.
item. Yeah,
Because some of
right.
it is just discussion that we were okay with, and others it's, big things like, okay, ballot IDs.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Got to make sure I finish today. We get through everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, Gemma, there's no need to go back through the slides again. It's they were introduced yesterday, so it's more about. I think we want to start the two that Dave Wagner has suggested we start with are wireless and the EDE, to make sure we have those discussions while we're here in a face-to-face environment, and then we'll see how much more we have time for. So it's if you want to, shall we start with wireless, perhaps, David? Okay. So Ben, maybe we can move the
Skip
slides
towards
forward.
the end to the open areas and just go to the wireless open area. Thanks, Ben. And this is Gemma. Are you wanting me to quickly go over the two slides or just jump right into questions? All right. Questions it is.
And David, maybe you, I know you have some concerns from the cybersecurity working group point of view that perhaps you want to start with.
Dave Wagner. To tee this up, I think that there is a significant, so the issues here are whether to prohibit wireless and whether to prohibit internet connectivity and telephony. So that internet connectivity would include things like cellular connections. And there's a significant component of the security community and advocates who would like to see the standard prohibit all wireless and prohibit internet and telephone connectivity. So that's the issue to decide upon for this body to decide is, does the TGDC want to prohibit those in the standards?
Thanks very much for that summary. Linda.
My concern with limiting it or prohibiting it rather than having some wiggle worm with it is we've got a whole generation of people that are coming up that do nothing but use the phone for everything. And if we don't start trying to find a way to do it, they're not going to be voting. They don't know what a stamp is. They don't go to a post office. And it seems to me short-sighted of us to say, no, you cannot do any of that. I think it would be better if we had some way of dealing with it so that at least people are trying to look at it to see if there's a way to move forward in the future. There may not be a post office in 10 years. So what do we do in that case for our absentee voters?
So I think there are at least three separate questions that we have to consider here. One is in polling place wireless. That could be Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or NFC, where the voting machines might be talking to one another or talking to assistive devices. That's sort of category 1. Category 2 is election night reporting and voter registration and things where there fundamentally is communication outside of the polling place, but generally only to the election center office. Then there's an entire third category, which is internet voting. And I think we should keep these categories completely distinct from one another and talk about them distinctly, because I certainly have distinct opinions on each of them, and I imagine many of you do as well.
Thank you.
Diane Golden, and I'll just add, I appreciate the distinction of the in polling place, voter interaction. As I was saying last night, the way the assistive tech world is moving, I mean, I don't know if we'll have hardwired connections for a lot of AT devices in the future. They're all going to be Bluetooth. I mean, most of them now, it's USB, and I know that's a concern. And anyway, but I mean, that's just the way technology is moving, is to wireless connectivity between the peripherals that people with disabilities use and whatever else they're trying to interface with. So just banning it outright might put us in a place where then you have no way of interacting using your own AT, which is obviously going to be a problem. So I'd say, again, that's the danger of just a flat no across the board.
This is Bob Giles. I agree, because one of the concerns is if you're using electronic poll books and those are communicating wirelessly or through Bluetooth within the polling place or back to a central location, and then you take that and you use that to program your activation card for the voting machine. So now it's touching the voting machine. In my opinion, that becomes part of the certification of the voting machine. That's how I would view it in New Jersey. So now if you just broadly say you can't do that, now I don't know how, vote centers, if they have to, or early voting, how that would work with an electronic poll book that also activates a voting machine.
And clearly, this is Paul Lux, clearly, the first thing that Dan mentioned as the first tier of information. I see how it is, Judd. That's okay.
Quite a mic drop.
He's just going to start throwing stuff at me, so you're going to get out of hand. But I would say the first two categories certainly, and to the concerns that Diane mentioned and that Bob mentioned, I think are something that we cannot necessarily dispense with outright, simply because those of us who still use the wireless technology for election night transmissions, I've got a geography problem. My county is a big rectangle. The northern border is Alabama, the southern border is the Gulf of Mexico, and I have a 20-mile wide swath of federal property that cuts me into two pieces with only one road that runs north and south. So I absolutely have polling places that are, I don't want to say in the middle of nowhere, because people from Alabama get upset when you say, that they're the middle of nowhere, but I mean, pretty darn close anyway, you can see it from there. And so, I mean, and I fought this battle for years with the political parties and the media for, we have to have results immediately, and, wouldn't you rather us take our time and do it right rather than rush this? Which, I mean, we can have a whole discussion about that, but as it relates to the technology side, and it isn't just me. I mean, Brevard County in my state, they are the longest county. It's almost a 2-hour, well, let's say 2 hours. It's almost an hour and a half drive from one end of their county to the other. So pick where you're going to put your election office in the county seat. Usually, you're again talking about some severely outlying areas in that election night reporting via whatever mode. I mean, of course, as we all know, hardline phones have sort of disappeared. You can still get one. They're no longer cheap, and if you have hundreds of polling places, you would have to install hardline things in all of those places to make that work without wireless technology. So.
And just to follow up, this is Bob Giles. I guess my concern is each state's different, and so if a state chooses to do the way you broke it down, any of these three options, but they require EAC certification, they're kind of stuck if we don't. So do we take the approach on all of these that they're not required to be in the system, but if a vendor wants to test to that, we do have testing or best practices? Because I don't know that we can dictate to every state that, no, you cannot use wireless, no, you cannot do internet voting. I mean, states are already doing mobile voting. It's happening, so I don't see how you stop that. And to Linda's point, there may be a time, especially with our military and overseas voters, giving them access to voting. The fax machines don't really exist. Email is somewhat problematic as well. So I don't think we just close the door on all these, but I think we make it optional, and we do put something in there should a state want to go down this path.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. Lori?
Lori Agino, I just want to be careful that we are staying with within what I believe is our wheelhouse, and that it's within the voting system that is being moved forward and tested, and that we are clear that that is where our comments are, and maybe take it out of election night results reporting if it's not contained within the voting system, or other ancillary systems that are not within the voting system.
I think just to that comment, like election night reporting, if you're taking some kind of flash drive or something out of the machine, you're going to put it into something else, or you're going to reuse that and touch the machine again. So for our election night reporting, it's one use when you're transferring that data. But if you're talking about something that the vendor has to reuse every time, that becomes an issue. If that is now touching the internet somehow, we in our state, we don't allow any voting system to touch the internet in any case, so that's why we just dispose of those flash drives every time they're used. So the concern is if you're doing something at a polling place, and do you have to, because those I'm sure are not cheap if you're getting them from the vendor, that you then have to reuse those for another election. Is there a way to make sure they're clean?
And it isn't even just the media, because the wireless modems are an internal component to the system. I mean, they have to be installed in the system. So, I mean, it has to therefore be tested as part of the system. It's tested as part of the logic and accuracy testing when we're doing all of that as well.
Great. Thank you for those points. So, Dan, were you going to add something here?
Wow. Okay, so one of the things that we could talk about is saying that, like, a wireless modem has to be here but not here. Wireless modems can be USB devices, and then they can be separate. And that could be a thing that we could regulate if we wanted. These standards that we've been reading and talking and are ratifying don't really speak to internet voting. It's a different threat model. It's a different consideration. It's a different kind of voting device. So I think it's out of scope for us to be talking about internet voting at all. It's just a totally other thing that we could be tasked with, but it's not what we're doing today, I don't think.
I think those are very fair points. I believe that around the table we've heard broad acceptance for the existence of wireless technology as an important component of flexibility that's available to each precinct and each state. I have not heard, though, any discussion about encryption standards, about cybersecurity related standards, industrial IoT or related Internet of Things types of standardization and reference. I mean, clearly those documents exist. They're part of the best practices that are available to support any standards and guidelines that will be advanced as part of VVSG 2.0.
I think that I may be in the minority, but I would not necessarily put myself and maybe someone else in this room in the same camp as what you just described.
Thanks. Let's have a bit more discussion about that, because it's quite clear that these are technologies that are rapidly evolving. The United States is in the build-out of a 5G set of networks that I believe we cannot ignore the fact that wireless is coming into many parts of our lives, as discussed here. But I wanted to make sure that whatever consideration is being given to wireless is actually utilizing the kind of standards and encryption technologies that would represent the latest and best in class.
I think that's a fair statement. I think that in the case of our vote by mail states in particular, we just don't share some of those same challenges or needs for that. And so we can build in protocols that provide for opportunities for sharing information that are outside of the voting system themselves. So from a vote by mail state, and I'm not sure if my colleagues agrees, but from a vote by mail perspective, it's just not something that's necessary for us.
This is Bob Giles. So then, is there a way to break it out away from a traditional voting system where maybe we do need some kind of wireless, but then for internet voting or mobile voting, since those aren't traditional voting systems that would go through this testing, I don't know if this committee would have to have a separate charge, or it's something that you could do separately to say, if somebody wanted to do mobile voting, because they already are, here are some standards, and here are some standards with blockchain, and addressing it separately, because it's not a traditional voting system, but it is a method of voting that is happening.
Yeah, I would say that, this is Mary, that certainly is not encapsulated in the requirements as they exist today, but it's certainly something that we could tee up for, for further development and discussion as part of the annual review processes.
Would that be de minimis?
No, I'm just kidding. I don't think so.
No.
David, thank you.
Okay, I think what I'm hearing here is that there is not support on the TGDC to prohibit wireless. There is not support on the TGDC to prohibit internet connectivity in the standards. Or prohibit voting systems from having that capability. So now I want to turn to Gemma to find out whether she has.
Could I just interject and say there's not sufficient or unanimous support?
Thank you.
Because speaking for myself, I would ban all the use of wireless in a polling place.
Okay. And I just wanted to back up, if it's okay, because I think it ties in maybe to where you're going. To Dan's point, I'm not sure that we've parsed out, being in more of these conversations in the last couple of years than I ever expected to. I've heard a point made that distinguishes between sort of the different pieces of the puzzle in the polling place. And so, distinguishes between a wholesale ban of wireless versus banning wireless in, for example, a tabulator. And if you have a separate, and again, this raises assistive technology and accessibility issues, but if you have a separate BMD and a separate tabulator, that to me feels like a different environment. Again, that may be opening a huge can of worms and a bunch of cost, but I just want to throw that out there.
Okay, so Dave Wagner. So the challenge that I now have is the working group. I would characterize the discussions as the primary feedback from the security folks on the working group was the best security measure we have is to prohibit this capability in the systems. So given that appears that is not an outright prohibition, is not something that would be supported by the TGDC, I now want to turn to Gemma and find out, Gemma, how are we on requirements? Do you have what we need? Do you think we have what we need in the requirements in front of us for requirements on this subject, given this decision?
So currently, the requirements cover a very small portion of this open area, but I think the specifics in what folks are may be looking for based on the discussion is not included. And so what we're prepared to do is we can develop requirements maybe for the specific use cases that were brought up. And then we also have Ben, if you don't mind going to the next slide. In the potential mitigations, we've kind of looked at these different options based on the feedback that we got. So as Dave Wagner mentioned, the first that came to the group was this idea of no wireless. So we have an idea of what that would look like with regards to the requirements. Another option would be to enable or disable wireless as needed. This could be based on the use case, when it's used, or how it's used. And then the last one, we're also prepared, as we have some previous requirements, I think in VVSG 1.1, around including wireless technology. And we would reference that and update those to include how wireless would be included in the voting system, what specific security configurations would fall around that. And this is specific to wireless, not necessarily speaking to internet technology. Internet technology, Ben, if you don't mind going 2 slides over. Internet technology, for internet connectivity, I'm sorry, we definitely have considered the no internet technology or connectivity being included in the voting system as we've talked about in the scope of this discussion. And then we also have recommendations for how to handle things like an election night reporting with the air gap options, as well as secure configuration around how that's actually performed. So those are not in the requirements that you have now, but we definitely have that information available and would be able to write requirements based on kind of which way you guys want to go for the internet and the wireless technology.
Hi, Gemma McDermott. So what we might start, we've got a lot of breadth as far as the threat model for these items. And what I might recommend is that we take this lesson from the accessibility and usability community and have an assessment done by a third party before you get to certification. One of the things we're trying to accomplish here is to shorten the certification period. This is definitely not doing that. And also making it, and we also want to incentivize the vendors to make better decisions moving forward, which is what the usability tests are supposed to do. So we do the tests and then we figure out, oh, this is what we should change before we get to certification. If we get to certification and this needs to happen, we've missed the boat. If we do the same sort of thing for security, and I know that Department of Homeland Security has got a great facility, that doing that sort of thing during the development process and being able to say, here's our risk model, here's how we mitigated it, and making that part of our submission to the VISTLs might actually not only improve the security, but also improve the process.
This is Gemma Howell. Just something that I want to bring up that was brought up during the working group calls as well. And to your point, I agree that would provide value in having that testing done up front. But the actual configuration and setup that happens in the polling place, guaranteeing that that happens the way it's done or the way it was done at the testing in that previous testing process is a concern from the working group that maybe the folks who actually set up these systems may not be able to meet those same standards.
Yes, David, thank you.
I want to see if I understand what the action item on this is. I think this is what I'm hearing, so tell me if I'm getting it right. I think the action item on this is that we ask Gemma and NIST to write requirements that reflect those alternative mitigations. That if we were to vote on adopting the requirements today, it would be subject to the addition of those additional requirements, and that the anything that our proposed VVSG would not be forwarded into the EAC until those were added. Do I have that correct? Is that the path forward?
I'm looking around the table here, and I believe that that's a good restatement of the actions. Any other comments or clarification on that follow-up point, Gemma?
I just wanted to review kind of what I have. So one mitigation that we had for wireless technology, no wireless hardware, that one is not, is potentially not being considered, or would you like to see the requirements for all the options that I've listed? Because I know it was mentioned earlier there wasn't some consensus on all of them.
So I think we have some sort of a consensus that local wireless, such as Bluetooth for assistive devices, is okay. I think that seems to be a consensus. Once we get to, say, in polling place Wi-Fi, if that's something to be discussed, then there would need to be appropriate security measures for crypto to keep random people from getting into that Wi-Fi. Once we start talking about internet connectivity, I like the idea of developing Plan A, no internet, Plan B, internet with careful controls, because some counties or states will regulate it one way or another. So if we say, if you're going to do internet, you have to do it this way. Otherwise, do sneakernet. I think that's a reasonable approach for us to take. I will note that you have a bullet that says telephone communication is on the no internet bullet. Really, the modern telephone network is the internet. There isn't really a meaningful difference between those anymore, which is to say, you know, to a nation-state adversary, it's just a funny-looking internet that they can still attack. So from that perspective, use of the telephone fits in the same category as use of wireless cellular. I mean, it's the same threat model, it's the same kind of mitigations, the same need for air gaps.
Thanks for those points of clarification. Yes, Gemma?
Sorry, this is Gemma. Just for clarification on that second bullet point, and it should have been included on the slide, but that one in particular is talking about sending unofficial election results as a temporary way to get that information there. So totally agree that the traditional telephone network or texting includes the internet and could be at risk for that.
Yeah, thanks. So the action has been, oh, yes, Judd.
So I have a quick comment. This is Judd. It seems to me, I'm going to make an argument to you, that maybe there's another way we can parse this that would make me more comfortable with it. And that is, I don't think that the way that the wireless works in a polling place now should include the conversation between the poll book and the voting system. I think that's where the problem is, because that's the way you get back to who the voter is. So you've got voter anonymity, and that's the way that is the most talked about way where vulnerabilities created by wireless exist in the voting system. I think that's the heart of the problem. Diane's concerns I'm very wary of, because I think that's where, yes, it's the future of the ways in which those in the disability community are going to operate in that voting system. So is there a comfort level with narrowing down wireless is permitted when it's in those circumstances only, but not permitted in a polling place under any other circumstances? Related to the voting system, because obviously the poll book is not a part of the voting system, and people operating on their phones and so forth are not a part of the voting system. But as it relates to the voting system, should we say you can't have your e-poll book connected to, or maybe in the reverse, wireless is only permitted in sort of extending ADA capabilities to the voting system?
So,
Yes, Paul.
Well, and this is Paul Lux, and I would agree with that, Judd, because so in my polling place, just to give you the example I'm most familiar with, yes, we have a MiFi device. That MiFi device connects my e-poll books back to election headquarters, so that as people are checking in and voting, they can't run off to another polling place and check in and vote because they just can't beat the computer system. But that's all the MiFi and all that network gets used for is the e-poll books talk among themselves, and the MiFi connects them to the outside world. The wireless that is in my voting system, in my actual tabulation device to send election results back to Election Central at the end of the night, that doesn't even get used or turned on until they say it's time to send the results. And so in that instance, that wireless connectivity is in no way, shape, or form connecting to anything else other than back to my central election system.
But in talking about these requirements, we're not building them to the existing technology that we know. And can we not find a way to, outside of the voting system, move those results safely from using methods that Bob discussed or methods that we can build out where we're transmitting those results, unofficial results that still require additional vetting to make sure that they transferred correctly outside of the voting system at all, so that you're keeping that voting system locked down and secure and pure?
So, Bob Giles, to Judd's concern or suggestion with the e-poll books, we don't have early voting yet in New Jersey, but it's been discussed. And so if you have early voting, the way I've been looking at it is the e-poll book talks back, so you can't have people going to multiple sites on the same day. But there's also the ability to activate the machine, because if you have an early voting site that you can vote any ballot in the county, you don't want the poll worker to make that determination necessarily to say, oh, you're in Toms River Ward 2. I got to activate that particular ballot. So the system will do that, and whether it's on a smart card or however it activates the machine. So therefore, we've got this wireless connection talking back to the voter registration system, and then the next step is it activates a card that touches the voting machine. So there's a concern that how do you, I don't know that you can have both. So, and I'm not saying you have to, but I think there should, if we're talking about requirements, because that does exist, that we would have to.
Yeah. Right. Thank you very much, Bob. Dan?
Dan Wallach, this is a place that I think is probably the most critical for us as a board to have some input, to talk about how data flows across these boundaries from the voter registration poll book system into the voting system. That boundary right now is very unregulated, and I think we could improve that a lot. Like, for example, we might say that the e-poll book can print a barcode on a disposable piece of thermal paper, which is then scanned, and then that barcode would only indicate a ballot style number and nothing else. And that would be the sort of thing that we could specify.
This has been really a wonderful conversation. And I'd just like to turn this over to Mary Brady to summarize where we are now and the actions that have been identified.
I'm not sure that I know.
You really keep us moving along.
Yeah.
There's no doubt.
Well, Gemma, perhaps you know. So it's, I mean, it's, I think we've talked about wireless. We've talked about wireless in the polling place. We've talked about e-poll books, that parts of e-poll books are not under scope for the current version of the VVSG. Other parts, like the activation of the ballot, is definitely, a part of the scope of the VVSG. I think, Bob, you're right. That's sort of the crux. Is it's, I think some of the other areas are easier. Certainly, in the case of accessibility, I think there's probably agreement that we should allow Bluetooth. I haven't heard a discussion yet about wireless in the polling place with respect to if you have a ballot marking device and you want to print to a wireless printer. So I haven't heard that come up, and is that something that we want to allow or disallow? So I'd say they're probably the three areas, right? Bluetooth in the polling place, general wireless connectivity in the polling place, both within the voting system, and perhaps if you're in your case, Paul, where you're taking it from the and you're aggregating upstream. And then activation, within the poll book. It's, if the poll book is touching talking back to your voter registration system, for instance, in order to keep folks from voting at multiple vote centers. And it also, ultimately produces something that's going to touch the voting system. Is there a better way to protect that connection? And
so the topic that was put on the table by Mary Brady now is wireless printing and sort of the boundary conditions that to which those should be applied. Any commentary from the group on guidance on that?
This is Jed. I oppose. And I would encourage all of my colleagues to oppose that.
Agreed.
So is it after it's been voted on a ballot marking device? Because there's also ballot on demand where same thing, it ties to the e-poll book. Instead of activating the machine, it goes to a printer to print a ballot on demand ballot that you then vote. And so if that's wireless, or does that have to be hard? Because you could have 3 or 4 printers, and then you sign in, and then it go to station 2 to get your ballot or whatever, however you set that up. So I'm not sure if that is wireless or it's
it certainly could be wireless.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So it could be that, but again, that's the ballot before it touches. That's just a paper ballot. But what you're talking about, if I use a ballot marking device, print it out, and does it print from the machine, or is there a separate printer? And there are vendors that talk about having a separate printer. So I don't know if that's connected, like a hard connection, or it's Wi-Fi.
So this is Dan Wallach. I would hope that we can say that the usual case is going to be Ethernet wires or equivalent, that most printers that you would use for this are going to have an Ethernet jack built in anyway, and I don't see any reason not to have Ethernet wires that are taped to the floor with gaffer tape. That seems like a completely reasonable way to solve the problem.
Well, and this is Paul Lux, and to Lori's point, though, but we are talking about standards for future voting systems, too. So, I mean, while right now I agree with you, and the ballot on demand I use in early voting and at some of my polling places is exactly that. I've seen such unreliability with wireless printing that I wouldn't want my backbone to be built on wireless printing to work in a polling place anyway, when I know I can just run 8 feet of Cat6 cable and go on about my life. So, obviously, right now, that's the norm, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we may not have that port available on those printers to do that with.
But I do think that we do want to write requirements for future systems, but I don't want this body to think that we're never going to be able to update these systems, so we have to write requirements for for the future. So I think as wireless technology improves, then perhaps that's the time to introduce, wireless and within the polling place for the for printing, for instance.
And we have discussed an annual process now for update and for review, and I believe this group collectively will be developing and advancing those recommendations that we believe are sound for the broadest potential use by America's voting network. So I will look forward to the revisions to that portion of the guidance document from NIST, and that there would then be a conference call or webcast with the members of the TGDC to ratify that section. One of the other areas that we have not yet discussed is the end-to-end, and so I'm just wondering whether now is an appropriate time for us to move to review and to discuss that. Yes.
Ben, can you advance the slides to EDE?
Okay. Okay. Please look at the slides. Cryptographic end-to-end.
Dave Wagner, if I could set this up. So cryptography E2E systems are new. We don't have any on the market today. We want to enable a new market there. It's a little bit challenging to write requirements for a new system. We have in the packet before you some minimal requirements, but there were some proposals from the working group to go further than this and to have some stronger requirements. So I think it's up there on the slide.
Maybe on the next slide. Sorry, sorry, Ben. Thanks.
Which involve.
I can step through it if you want.
Which involve requiring that the cryptographic protocol be published, that there be a reference implementation made publicly available of the verification that's used for audits and verification for transparency purposes, and that there be an independent review by a security expert of the cryptographic protocol. So let me set up for you why those might make sense. They're not currently in there. It's, it's not, I think there's a decision to make about whether to include those.
Can I ask a preliminary question? And my apologies if this has already been addressed and I just missed it. But it's my understanding that end-to-end has never formally been covered for certification. Am I right in saying that? And are we then proposing to wade into certification of end-to-end systems? And if we are going there, I'm fully supportive of that. So.
Dave Wagner, it's never before in the standards have the standards supported certification of end-to-end systems explicitly. This standard is the first one that explicitly supports certification of end-to-end systems. We require for auditability and verifiability either a paper record or cryptographic end-to-end systems. Those are the two alternative paths. It's currently in there that's supported, and the goal to support that.
Then don't let me stand in your way. You go right ahead.
Great. Any other comments, David?
So the thing that's unique about the cryptographic systems is they're very reliant on this cryptographic protocol, these mathematical algorithms. They're very intricate. For the rest of voting systems, for cryptography, we can say, use the same thing that industry and government is using in other sectors. And that works, and those are solid, and we have a lot of vetting for those because they're used elsewhere. But the cryptographic protocols that are needed for cryptographic E2E are very specialized to voting. And so they need special review that we can't just say use some existing thing because there is no existing thing. So there's a question about how to do that. We don't think the VIA voting system, the VSTLs have the capability to do that. So a proposal from some folks on the cybersecurity working group was to add these three requirements. Expert review, basically.
This is Paul Lux. Dave, just out of curiosity then, so when you talk about utilizing an open standard, which I would equate then to some published standard for cryptography, would that be to the extent that and I guess I'm a little I'm way in over my head now at this point, but are we talking about, like, could somebody use the fact that they're using published standard 1, 2, 3, 4, so now to get into this end-to-end system, I know how to break into it because I know they're using this published standard for the cryptographic security?
Dave Wagner, well, Gemma, you can correct me if I get this wrong. I had the impression that the proposal was not so much that it's a standard, but that it's published specification or published protocol. So it might be the vendor says, I've got this great idea for, we're going to use this cryptographic protocol, and it's published. The crucial part is published. Or they might say, well, there was this academic paper that describes how to do it. Okay, so your main concern was, by making it public, do we make it easier for hackers to hack into it? And the answer is no. The purpose, the way these systems are designed is specifically so that all these details can be made public without endangering security. That's a key part of the transparency. That's how we gain trust. The way you gain trust in a cryptographic EDE system is that some mathematical cryptographer who you trust and rely on looks at this publicly available information and says, oh, that's a good cryptographic design, you can trust the system because the cryptography is good. So to support that That's where the publication is designed to support.
So, this is Dan Wallach. I'm going to agree with everything Dave just said, that the name of the game is that this is not open, like free for anybody to use necessarily, but this is open, like disclosed and published, such that anybody can review it, and which means anybody can find problems with it, and then there can be a process for resolving those issues, and that's the vendor needs to not hide behind trade secrecy. That's the important part.
If I can follow up. So as a follow-up question then to what I've just heard both of you say, and to make sure I'm understanding it correctly, not saying this is exactly what you're talking about, but I mean, so if we were to say, we're going to use 256-bit encryption, which means, and I probably am going to get this totally wrong, so forgive me, all of you technical people, but so I'm going to pick 256 random characters as a string, and I'm going to somehow use that to then encrypt this thing. And if you want to decrypt it, you have to guess the same 256 characters, or there's no way in. So 256-bit, clearly better than 128-bit encryption, way clearly better than 64-bit encryption. So we're going to go to, one Googleplex encryption, or, which is like, might take somebody 5 billion years to hack, or perhaps, a nation state actor, 84 minutes. I don't know. But that's kind of what you're talking about as a published standard.
Yeah.
So I guess when we mean...
Just a second here.
So it is important to note that ciphers do get decoded at points, and so this emphasizes the resolutions that you all proposed earlier and the need for consistent review and update. So these go concurrently.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so clearly this is not my area of expertise either, but I'm just going to, an external expert evaluation I get makes sense. My question and concern is, who's an expert? And okay, so from my naive outside, okay, so if somebody's going to ask me for an accessibility expert, I can do that, but somebody else might not think that person's an expert, and my assumption is the security side of the camp is even more like that than my side of the camp is, about who's actually got expertise and who doesn't, and what expertise in which area. My kind of guess is on your, from a vendor perspective, I would be scared. I don't know who you're going to pick, because whoever you pick, you're going to get blasted by somebody, because that's not going to be the right security expert giving you that review. And I don't know what the testing labs are going to do with that information.
So if I could just
who's that? Why? Who's using that expert external information? And what's it have to do with certification? If the labs don't have that expertise, then are they supposed to use that external evaluation carte blanche? And it's like, if they say it's okay, I have to say it's okay, and if they say it's not, then I have to say it's not. I'm concerned from the labs, and I don't know how that's going to work in the certification process.
So this is a standardization question, and so NIST, as the U.S. government's lead on standards, is actually the lead on cryptographic algorithms. We work closely with DHS and the National Security Complex, and so this would be a follow-on activity around standardization for advanced cryptographic algorithms appropriate to the voting system.
Okay.
So, and this is Bob Giles, just to follow up with Diane. I mean, we see this where, like with risk limiting audits, they develop the auditing software, and then all of a sudden somebody said, well, who's auditing the auditing software? Like, where does it end? And so the concern is, okay, we're saying this is good cryptology, but is somebody going to come along to Diane's point and say, no, it's not, I say it's not? And so are we going to say NIST is the standard, and if NIST says it's good, it's good? I guess that's our concern, because we don't want to do it, and then somebody comes and says, well, that person's not really an expert, I'm an expert, and then you get slammed.
Well, this is a global process. We're in the midst now of post-quantum cryptographic algorithm assessments that are much larger, much more robust than what we're currently utilizing. And so it's a standardization effort that involves a broad range of expert groups, and it involves industry as well as the public sector. So, I mean, we can talk about. I don't think we want to go down this rabbit hole too far about how we actually fully assess the strength and the capability of cryptographic algorithms. There are processes in place that will be advanced as this particular recommendation is advanced. I think it's been said that this is a developmental challenge looking to the future of end cryptographic types of solutions. But I think what's been proposed here in the VVSG section is at least to provide a starting point on this journey for addressing these questions. And so, yeah, Dave.
Dave Wagner. So these are great comments, and they're also exactly the challenges we were wrestling with when we started talking about this. So I think what I would suggest we do is that we ask Gemma and NIST to write some requirements surrounding this. The kind of thing that I'm imagining is that maybe we could specify something about what's a suitable expert, and we'd have to think about how to make sure that the expert will be acceptable so that you don't hire someone and later find out they were no good. And we have to think about how the report would be used. It's possible maybe one model might be it's submitted to the EAC as part of their certification, or submitted to the VSTL, and then they make a decision based on what the report says. Those are the kind of the options that I can see. I want to our chair, I want to give a little bit of a caution about being careful about what you commit NIST to. So NIST has the world-leading cryptographic validation program, but the thing to be cautious about there is that's for cryptographic algorithms that are the standard everyday ones that are used throughout industry and the government. Those are not the kind of algorithms that we're talking about for cryptographic E2E systems. For cryptographic E2E systems, they're using this very specialized, custom, very intricate algorithms that are not supported as part of that program. And I suspect that NIST probably does not want to commit to validating those because that would be a substantial project. So I don't anticipate the NIST cryptographic validation program to actually be able to support this or help us or ensure that these algorithms are any good, because it's just beyond the scope of what most of the rest of industry and government needs. So that's why instead of relying on if we could rely on the cryptographic validation program, that would be great, but I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think I would warn you about committing NIST to take on that project. So instead, this is the alternative, is that instead of having NIST put a stamp on, say, this is a good algorithm, which I think is probably too much to ask from NIST. Instead, we have this more minor version, which is it has to be public so that independent experts can form their own trust, and it has to go review by one crypto expert as part of the certification process.
So
Can I ask? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I mean, the one thing I will add is that we do routinely provide guidance to the labs as part of our laboratory accreditation process, that there is a manual that's available that the labs have to adhere to, and we do provide guidance on what type of expertise you need to look for in terms of if you're trying to get an expert for usability or accessibility or in security in the case of penetration testing, what type of expertise do you need to have?
Just very briefly, this is, I think, what I heard Walt saying is that NIST has standards expertise, and the base documents for this cryptographic module validation program, while not directly relevant to this, there's security requirements for cryptographic models. You have a lot of base in terms of documents that have been written and guidance that certainly gives you NIST a leg up in looking at the technical requirements, not actually validating the cryptographic modules necessarily, but you don't even think the documents are relevant? Well.
Sorry. It just leads into a general question I've had about this, which I thought Diane had covered, but now I feel like we haven't. So, I mean, real high level. I mean, if we're talking about cryptography that is beyond what there are commercial uses for or general needs, I mean, how many people, and I'm not asking for like 7, but, you know, I mean, broad level, you know, how many, I mean, is this, clearly it is not a common skill, but is it common enough to be utilized in this fashion, or are we there yet? You know, I know that particularly in the last few months we've come a long way. Obviously, I know there is a certain element of pressure on this body to address this issue because we want to both be looking forward and fear that this will potentially be the last bite at the apple for a while. Hopefully, some of the resolutions earlier pay dividends to revisit some of this. But I mean, will we be light years ahead a year from now on this issue with the developments that are happening in the space? And then again, I back up to, I mean, is it Ron Rivest and a couple other people that know how to do this, or is it broader than that?
This is Dan Wellick. I think we should definitely ask Ron Rivest to do all of the work for us. But since he's likely to say no, there are probably greater than 10 and less than 100 academics who we could come up with who would be capable of doing a review like this, and there's probably as many people in industry who have similar skills. In terms of conflicts of interest, you probably would rather draw from the academic community, so that way you don't have one vendor worrying about a conflict from another vendor. And, you know, exactly how you go about maybe the answer is that NIST forms review bodies of suitable academics. So NIST, like, vendor goes to NIST and says, I need a review. NIST finds the right people. I don't know how the cash flows, and then a panel of experts writes a report.
Yeah, I believe that there are processes in place that have high integrity that would bring together the very best minds in the United States and potentially from other parts of the world to crack this problem. So just to bring,
I just have one question. So are we looking to come to an agreement so that we can include this in 2.0? And then take a vote on potentially on that as part of this package today? Or are we looking at something that will allow for a little bit more review and discussion for the E2E components?
Dave Wagner, my question to you all was whether to develop something to include in the VVSG today. Yes. So do you all want us to do that work and include this in the VVSG 2.0? Those are not in here in this packet. I think there's a significant number on the cybersecurity working group who would advocate for that and are hoping that you will say yes.
Do you have a timeline? This is Bob Giles. Do you have a timeline that you would think?
This is Gemma, for drafting the requirements. We have some requirements drafted. It would just be cleaning them up and then bringing them to you.
And Gemma, do you have a sense for the timing to have those core requirements available?
Maybe, I don't know, I'm looking at Mary. I'm hesitant to give timelines.
I think, I think part of what we're talking about, that if we move to a vote today, the vote would look something like, okay, we want to move forward with the standards with these caveats, that you will be bringing these requirements to us within 30 days, for instance, and we'll have a web meeting to discuss it and to make sure that, yes, we're still comfortable. So does that kind of approach seem appropriate, or is it possible? Or is it far more work and we're looking at 6 months? So it's almost like the big dog scales, 1, 3, 5, 7. It's not, not 1 or 2.
Well, I guess if we're talking about all of these open areas, it might require a little more time than 30 days. If we're talking about just this E2E section, I could probably turn around the draft requirements. I think 30 days would be reasonable. If you need it in a shorter time, I could do 3 weeks. Or 2 to 3 weeks, yeah.
Dave Wagner, I think we'd be talking about the wireless we discussed and this crypto EDE discussion, those two.
Can I ask one other question, as a point of clarification on, obviously there's value in getting these requirements, and that will aid in the development and innovation in this area, but is there also a way within the other requirements to instill protections if one of these systems is developed but not really ready for the polling place because of other issues? Like Diane's raised the accessibility piece on the receipt. I mean, are there other pieces within, I guess, the requirements that would say, obviously secrecy comes to, I mean, that's the biggest piece in it, but other sections of this where you go, okay, you could start developing a system and you would understand what it would look like, but unless you can do these other things, you're not going to be there anyway. I don't know.
Dave Wagner, I think the approach that we had envisioned was not, we're just giving you part of the requirements. We had envisioned that this is everything. Yes. If you're a vendor, you got everything. You meet these and you're good. So we're trying to really nail down all the requirements, and we know it's the first time that a standard has specific requirements for cryptographic EDE, so it's a first cut, but yeah, I think that we were taking a different approach there.
I should back up too in thinking about that. I know as we walked through, there were flags where, there were areas, if you have an E2E, this is a different situation. And I think that is more of what I was thinking about. Obviously, you would have to comply with everything, but are there other areas within the requirements that you would need to consider slightly differently for an end-to-end system to ensure that you have those safeguards? I just raised that.
Dave Wagner, I think we've got all the ones that I know of. If others know of something we've missed, I'd like to hear about it.
So this is Judd. I just want to tell you, I mean, we've done some important things in the last day and a half, but this is the single most important thing that we're going to do as a body in this meeting. And so I congratulate you all on going this way. And on NIST for having some requirements in the can that we can, and Gemma, for your work to try to get this thing down the runway pretty quickly.
So I'm going to try to summarize again. This isn't my wheelhouse per se. My personal thought is we need to do this because otherwise, if you don't, then your whole premise of software independence being an option more than paper is bunk. You have to go back and undo that. Because if you don't have any requirements to get an EDE system through certification, then it can't be used in most places, which means that really isn't an alternative to paper. So your whole discussion about software independence is going to have to be revised if you don't do this. Because without this, you can't send those systems through certification. I mean, I don't know how you would, because you'd have no standards to test it to. So I kind of think it's a foregone conclusion. You have to do this unless you're going to revise the whole software independence standard and discussion, et cetera. And I hopefully, and back to my original, hopefully this gets the folks who are thinking about EDE to realize they got some accessibility issues they're going to have to address, and they can't blithely just keep on doing what they're doing and saying, woohoo, I'm paperless, I'm accessible. Maybe not. No.
And this is Bob Giles. Do you have a definition of what you guys are considering an end-to-end system specifically, so we're all on the same page when we're talking about this? Is that...
That's a great question.
This is Gemma. To As far as specifically in the requirements, in a requirement, we probably wouldn't call it out, but what we would talk about are some of the properties of an end-to-end verifiable system. And I think we could probably do that with some of what we talked about with revising the requirements. That first bullet there under the mitigations calls out the different properties, and what we would want is some detailed documentation on how the end-to-end system meets the specific properties of the voting system. And so I don't know that we have a specific definition called out in there, but we do outline the properties of an end-to-end voting system and how that differs from some of the typical voting systems.
I don't think there's a definition in there that I can see immediately. If I was going to give you a flip answer, the flip answer would be, for the purpose of certification, a cryptographic EDO system is one that meets all the requirements in here for crypto EDO systems. And I suspect that an academic would say it's a system that uses cryptography to ensure that, to provide software independence or voter verification, or to ensure that voters can verify that their vote was cast as they intended and counted as it was cast.
Thank you so much, David, for that. I'm going to turn it over now to Mary Brady to walk us through the remaining items before we go to a vote on VVSG 2.0.
Okay, so I went back through the rest of our handout here from the notes from yesterday, and I've identified 5 additional areas that we have not yet discussed, but they were discussed at great length yesterday. So these are all in, is that right? Are they all in the security area? Let me just first state what they are. So the first was ballot IDs with respect to risk-limited audits, and there was a discussion on overlaps, perhaps overlaps and distinctions between 915F and 94C. I do believe that we, through that discussion, we got to some suggested changes in the requirements, but it was also talked about with respect to ballot secrecy, and is there some way to unwind or to crack the order in which random numbers are generated and thereby applied to the ballot, and between that combination and perhaps having someone in the polling place knowing the order in which people voted, that you could actually figure out how someone voted. In that particular case, for the ballot secrecy, there were some suggestions on perhaps this could be dealt with through the use of a strong algorithm to ensure that you're generating truly random numbers, or a requirement that prevents someone from cracking the order in which the random numbers are generated. So there's a potential path forward there as well. The third area was in preserving logs, in that we did not want the ability to delete logs for some period of time. I seem to remember the period was 22 months, or at least 22 months. So I think there's a path forward there as well. There's the issue of multi-factor authentication for critical operations. That was the fourth area that I identified, and we can go back through these. And I think in that particular case, we had some folks who were in favor of dropping from the list of critical operations opening and closing polls, and others who said, you don't really need a list. It's all, you need multi-factor authentication for everything. We can certainly discuss that further, but my general feeling there is perhaps we need additional election officials to weigh in, and I think that would happen as a result of the review process, and in particular the standards board and those election officials who participate in the board of advisors. And the last one was actually smaller and pretty easily dealt with. It was on the use of strong passwords. And in this particular case, I believe we were leaving it up to the administrator to define what a strong password was. And the suggestion was that we don't leave it up to the administrator, but we require that we use strong passwords per NIST recommendations. And that's all I have, actually, in terms of the remaining areas, or the remaining topics. Do you want to go through them one by one, or?
Codes?
No, I think that if there are any questions.
Oh, no, you're right. There was a barcode, but I actually did not capture that there because you were asking for barcode formats. But there were no requirements, I don't think, that required that. There were no changes to the requirements.
David?
Yes.
I think there were two issues on barcodes. There was one on requiring the format be publicly specified, and I think there was agreement for that, and that's a
Right.
minor change to the requirement that can be instituted. And the second was one that I raised about requiring the ability to export the code book, and that discussion was tabled. So I don't know what the resolution on that one was.
Exactly. And I just think it's really important to address because of the 93% feedback about banning barcodes and just what's happening nationally. I just think it's probably pretty critical to make sure this is clear what the actual position is about using barcodes and that not messing with security.
So it was both the format, and I did actually note it just didn't make it to the back of the page. So is the notion of the barcode formats, but also the semantics or the meaning of the.
I mean, perhaps we could just use the word transparency, that what the barcodes mean should be well-documented, public, transparent, something like that.
So the mapping of the codes within the barcodes.
And Mary, this is McDermott, sorry to add to the long and distinguished list. I feel we do need to bring up the concept of patents against the standard. We are definitely, this standard is fairly prescriptive. And so I think we need to have some sort of process and policy for dealing with people who have patented something that is becoming a standard.
Okay.
Thankfully, we have people around the table who deal with these standards essential patents issues all the time. This is a standardization process, and I think there's very good documentation available for how those should be handled on a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory license terms to enable the practice of the standard. Mary, is there something, Mary Saunders, anything that you'd like to add there?
I'm just nodding my head. Yes, there is an ANSI patent policy and related guidelines to the patent policy, and this has continues to be a topic of significant interest in many technology areas, standards essential patents. But I think it's a good thing to have a policy established.
Right, so that should be a part of this standard.
Yeah, I believe we can reference the appropriate documents. It perhaps will just require a footnote, but there are indeed those best practices in place currently to which this new set of guidelines should refer.
That's all I'm asking.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you, that's a great and a very, very, very important point. We are approaching noontime, which is when I know some of us need to go. And I'd like to ask Ben Hovland for any additional comments that you'd like to raise. I know that there are some action items here. They've been well debated, well discussed with this wonderful committed group of experts for America's voting system. So I would like us to move soon to a vote on the VVSG version 2.0, incorporating the actions that have been addressed in the subsequent text to be agreed by this group. Ben?
Thank you, Dr. Copen. I would note that, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think what we're discussing as a vote is if all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. Clearly, there remains work, particularly, thankfully, for NIST to do. To get some of these things cleaned up. I do think there are significant questions on some of the last pieces that we were talking about on the end-to-end. I do think that it's worth considering. I think that's extremely exciting, but I think we need to think about what is the timeline that adds to this process. And so, I don't. Again, it was discussed that we may do a follow-up conference call like we've been doing. I will say, as the fact that the law requires me to be there as DFO. I will be present and will find a way to be available whenever everyone else can make it. But I do want us to be conscious of sort of the size of the list that we are creating and the timelines that adds to this process. So I just would mention that, and I don't know if that impacts how we think about this.
Thank you very much for those comments. I believe, Mary, you and the team have been collating a comprehensive list. The action items will then include the provision of the updated VVSG 2.0 to the members of the TGDC. There'll be availability to provide additional sort of fine-tuning comment to get to that point where we have the I's dotted and the T's crossed. This is an important step for the country, and thank you all for your commitment to the journey. Thank you to all the experts who have sacrificed in many ways so much to get us to this stage. I would like us now, in consideration of that and consideration of the fact that we are looking for the group to get together on a follow-up call to review the subsequent changes to ratify then version 2.0 of the VVSG. Having said that, I'd like to go to a vote. For those of you, based on all of the commentary, based on the actions that have been outlined, the question is, do you vote to accept the version 2.0 of the VVSG for ratification, for updating, and to go forward in the process of review with the Commission and with the Standards Board?
Just for clarification, requirements.
Requirements, indeed.
Yes.
Thank you. Yep, David?
I'd like a point of clarification about what we're accepting. Are we voting that we tentatively accept the direction this is going, and that there will be revisions made, and then we will be asked again to vote on the final version, and that no version will be transmitted to the EAC until we've finished that process? Is that what we're doing?
Yes. Well said.
Thank you.
I'll just ask another question. Do we really need to vote later? I mean, what's the background behind the vote today? What does that do other than us just sitting around and nodding and say, yes, we need to meet again and look at these revisions?
Yeah, right. It's perhaps more symbolic than anything, but with the agreement of this group that this is the process that we're on, and that our intention is to complete and then submit the VVSG 2.0 for the rest of the process. I just wanted to make sure to validate that we feel that we are on the right track to do so.
Do you mind if I make
This is Bob Giles. You've done a great job trying to keep us on track and getting us to that point. There's no doubt about it. I'm not comfortable at this point voting on these. I think we're headed in the right direction. I'm not ready to kind of just hand it over even and say there'll be revisions. It was talked about, is this our, we're concerned, last bite of the apple kind of thing. We are going to be meeting again by phone to discuss the recommendations to the EAC. So I think we have some time. There's a lot of action items, and we went through very quickly. And I've gotten some correspondence from other people already that there are other things that we've missed in this last day and a half that should probably be addressed on the front end before we even get to public comment that we didn't get to today. And I think there might be an opportunity to do that. And in the meantime, in good faith, I think it would allow the EAC to address resolutions 1 and 2 so we can be more comfortable that there will be an annual process, that we're not dealing with the last bite of the apple. I mean, I think that gives Ben, I'm putting it on you and the commissioners, to come back and say, you know what, we took your resolutions, we took them seriously, we actually took action on them. Then I would be more comfortable moving forward, and with the possibility of us missing something, and not worrying now it's going to take 2 more years to fix something. So, I mean, I don't know how everyone else feels, but that's my opinion.
One thing I'd like to, I guess, think about or see if it's there, or if there are distinctions that can be made. I think the question is there a piece of this? I guess, obviously, the most work probably needs to be done on the last items. Is the bulk of this in a position where, I guess you have to make a decision if we want everything we talked about to be in one ready to go, or if it's worth bifurcating something like the end-to-end and saying, okay, everything else we're pretty comfortable with, we don't want to hold up this package. If we need broader discussion, again, I think that's useful. And again, like I said, we've done all these calls. We can continue to do that. I just want to be clear that we are exploring options to both get this right, but get this done in as timely of a manner as possible.
So I think that the method that you just described is exactly what NASED and other from the elections community have asked for. And that's a nimble process to be able to review these requirements outside of this process where the TGDC takes a vote, and then they go to the standards board, and they go to the board of advisors, and then they go out for public comment. So because of the need to move quickly, we have advocated for that for a long time. And I think what we heard from you and from your legal counsel today was that that's not a possibility. So I think if we want to be very thoughtful and thorough in these requirements as a part of this official process, then I think that we have to wait until they're in a more final state. And if we can accomplish that in the next 30 days, based on the work that Gemma and NIST and EAC staff are going to go do over the next month in consultation with some of the constituency groups, or whatever we're calling them now, I'd feel much more comfortable as my colleague Bob to wait those 30 days. We've all got some work to do to come back as a body and then feel a little bit better prepared to take that vote that you're requesting.
Other comments on this topic of can we go to a vote on those items that have been fundamentally agreed and are in good shape, and then those additional ones, including the cryptographic and the wireless technology pieces. Other comments, please.
This is Diane, and I don't disagree with the concept we're back to de minimis and technical changes versus substantive and that whole discussion, and I don't agree there may be a chunk that we have to set aside because we can't agree on. The problem is it's not clean, simple, clear, and they're interrelated and they overlap, and like I said, if you pull the EDE out, then you got to go back and change the whole software independence discussion because that's not accurate anymore. Yeah. It's just not an easy, like it's this 1-2-page thing we can just set out. It's like you got to go back through the whole thing, and I would say depending on who's sitting around this table and the election officials, what's de minimis to me is not de minimis to somebody else in terms of their life and their priorities and in the election, community. So, yeah,
Any other viewpoints to share on this? Because what I'm understanding is that we will defer then going to a vote until the document is advanced to the point that the group agrees as a TGDC. Yes? I'm seeing nods around the table. So we will do that. Thank you so much.
Can we schedule?
Yes.
Do it now while we're all sitting in this room?
I think we're
Get a
all
date?
free on November 5th, aren't we? No?
More than 30 days.
Oh, that's right.
Just sort of as a point, the important piece is that so I'm just trying to get confirmation from Ben that in terms of timeline, what's our real target? So we say, we'd like 30 days, but what's the drop dead in terms of we've missed our opportunity? And I think with respect to the HAVA process, there needs to be enough time for NIST to, after TGDC adoption, for NIST to transmit the document to the executive director at the AAC, and there's enough time there to get it out to the boards, in consideration, and get it out to the Standards Board and the Board of Advisors who are, do we know when they're scheduled to meet?
I've heard generically April, but I don't believe those dates have been confirmed. But I welcome other input.
Well, I'm not anxious to provide other input, but you look, just realistically, the window, by extending it to 30 days, you may already be missing that window. And I say that because I know how long it took to adjudicate the VVSG comments, and you'll get a lot of comments on requirements. So if the board meetings are in April or May, 90 days gets you about a 30-day period to adjudicate all the comments. And that may be a push. And that's suggesting that the requirements were ready to go today. And when we did the VVSG in September of 17, it took about a month to get from NIST back to the executive director. So that's the timeline you're working with. And then we know now that the EAC will be in a continuing resolution through November 21, and therefore can't plan or commit to funding expenses for a meeting yet until after that period. So the April-May could get pushed a bit, and if the April-May gets pushed a bit, then that window hasn't been lost. So, I mean, that's kind of the moving pieces that you're dealing with.
Okay, so let me try to understand this and then try to restate it in perhaps a different way. If I'm understanding you correctly, the desire is to have the requirements in the hands of the Standards Board and Board of Advisors for 90 days prior to their meeting.
I think
because
then I would
they're
look back
required to have, you're required to give them 90 days.
Right, and I'd go back to Vice Chair Hovland to step in, but I think the thought is, what I believe I've heard from commissioners, that's why I'd ask him to step in, there'd be a concurrent period as public comment and the period to the advisory boards. And I think, unless Cliff could say something different, I don't think they could pass something in day 80. I think it'd have to have been the 90, but I may be wrong about that. So yeah, and it really is going to come down to how long it takes to adjudicate all the comments.
I think we're still fine.
I would say lawyering on the fly, which is dangerous, particularly because I'm not that good of a lawyer. My memory of it is that it says we can't, the executive director transmits, and then the commission cannot vote for 90 days after that transmittal. So I think more than it is, I think the question is more, do they have enough time to review? And if we have to wait, a month after the boards to then vote, so be it. Because we also have, there's the other pieces of the puzzle, which are the public hearing, which are there's the public comment, and that's what we were talking about could potentially overlap. So I think the issue would be ensuring that the other boards have it in time to review before their meetings to be able to provide sufficient guidance or input if they so choose. And then ideally that would be overlapped within then some, at least, if not all, of the 90 days of public comment.
Just to touch on the scheduling, because we're going to have presidential primaries next year, so I think we're more looking towards May. I think March, April would be tough to get the Standards Board together. Yeah. So I don't know that, and again, we're obviously going to have to reach out to the Standards Board and see what time works for the bulk of the board to get them together. But usually that March, April would be pretty tough, I think, in a presidential year.
So I think that may be right. In 19, I thought April would be better, and the Standards Board wanted May, and somehow I I think we kind of got to what the date we were, but the early indications were April was better than May this time, but that's a group of 5 people who said that, so.
Let's pick a date.
We have proposals.
October 11th, October 17th, October 23rd. Any of those dates look good for anybody?
October 11th is way better for me. I have our statewide tabletop exercises on October 17th.
The 11th, 17th, or 23rd?
Wow. Is there any time on the 11th?
Well, I'm flying. Not really, because I'm presenting and flying.
23rd?
23rd?
All in favor, say aye. Oh.
11 and 17 are fine for me, 23 is a little different.
Puts past the 30 days.
Yeah, but
Pass it, I know.
Should this be a doodle
That
poll?
puts us
and-
past the 30 days, though. We just passed the resolution
Yep.
that said 30 days.
we revised the resolution.
Yeah.
37 days.
23rd is good for me, but
23rd works for me.
that's good for Dan.
Easy.
Yeah, you don't have to fly to DC.
14th?
Well, I was going to say, because I just have surgery I have to schedule on the 17th, but
Columbus
that's in the morning, so. 14th.
That's Columbus Day.
Columbus Day.
That won't work.
We call that Indigenous Peoples'
Indigenous
Day,
Peoples' Day.
but not a holiday for us, so.
15? 16?
October 15th?
Would it be more helpful for us to come to a point of adjournment here and then work on the scheduling and as quickly as possible agree to
And I think setting this deadline to actually work toward a final product is going to help hold everyone's feet to the fire, because those deadlines that start ticking, I don't think you can send these documents to the Standards Board and the Board of Advisors in their current form anyway. So I think that this actually process will help us stay on track overall in the long run.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So in view of all these conversations, I'd like to thank everyone for your participation, for your hard work, for everyone who's been a contributor to this effort. And we look forward to seeing the revised draft of VVSG 2.0 in advance of the meeting requirements. Thank you. Before our conference call to be established. Thank you so much. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.
I just real quick want to say thank you for your engagement in this process. It's been extremely helpful, and we're very appreciative of you spending as much time as you did with us.